The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I pulled my old, beaten-up truck off the narrow gravel road onto the small dirt clearing in front of the cabin. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the dense wall of trees that surrounded this place, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like fingers trying to pull the light back. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. A chance to get away from everything. No phones, no people, just me and the quiet of the forest. The cabin was nothing fancy, built by someone long ago who must have wanted a simple retreat from the world. It was a one-room wooden structure with a slanted roof, a small stone chimney, and windows that were clouded with age and dirt. The wood was weathered and gray, with patches of moss clinging to the sides. A rickety porch ran along the front, littered with fallen leaves and pine needles. The whole place felt forgotten by time. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching on the gravel, and took a deep breath. The air smelled cold, fresh, and faintly of wet wood and moss. The sun was now low, casting everything in a dull orange glow. I grabbed my backpack from the bed of the truck, slung it over one shoulder, and started up the steps. The wood creaked under my weight, and I reached for the door handle, feeling the chill in the metal. The door opened with a groan, revealing a dark interior that smelled of old wood and dust. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. A wood stove sat against the far wall with a pile of split logs stacked neatly nearby. A small wooden table and 2 chairs occupied one corner. A narrow bed with a thin mattress rested against the opposite wall, covered with a faded quilt. A few shelves held old cookbooks and cans of beans and soup, all covered in a fine layer of dust. The windows let in just enough light to see the outlines of everything but left most corners in shadow. I set my backpack down and went straight to the stove. I had brought some kindling and a lighter. My fingers were cold, so I rubbed them together as I built a small fire. The wood caught quickly, and soon the soft crackling of flames filled the quiet cabin. The warmth spread slowly, pushing back the chill that clung to the walls. Outside, the forest was already settling into night. The sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant howl of a coyote. It was the kind of quiet that made your skin crawl, the kind where every little noise feels sharper and closer than it should. I sat down at the table and pulled out my food: a can of beans, a small loaf of bread, and a flask of coffee. The flame flickered in the stove's glass door, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move on their own. I ate slowly, the quiet pressing in on me. The forest was beautiful, but it was also a place where you could feel utterly alone. After eating, I cleaned up and brought out my sleeping bag. I spread it over the bed and lay down, listening to the fire crackle and the wind whispering through the trees outside. The temperature was dropping fast, and soon the window panes began to fog with my breath. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside, felt loud in the silence. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the house settling or animals moving through the underbrush, but there was a tight knot of unease twisting in my stomach. Somewhere deep in the woods, a branch cracked sharply, like something heavy was stepping through the brush. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding. I lay still, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the quick, skittish rustle of a rabbit or squirrel. It was heavy and steady. I wanted to tell myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the weight in my chest told me otherwise. I sat up slowly, careful not to make noise. The fire was dying down, casting faint light. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and clicked it on, the beam cutting a narrow path through the dark cabin. Outside, the forest was pitch black except for the light from the cabin. I stepped to the window and peered out. The beam swept across the trees and ground, revealing nothing but shadows and the occasional movement of leaves. Then, about 50 feet from the porch, I caught a glimpse of something large. A shape. It wasn't clear, just a dark silhouette against the darker forest. But it was there. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I backed away from the window and sat down hard on the bed, running my hands over my face. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the forest was playing tricks on me. But the sounds didn't stop. There was slow, heavy breathing just outside. Not close enough to see clearly, but near enough to hear. It wasn't the kind of breathing an animal makes, short and quick. This was long and steady, deliberate. I grabbed my phone to check the time, but there was no signal. Of course, no one could reach me here. I was completely cut off. The fire was almost out, and I needed more wood. But the idea of stepping outside when something was out there stopped me cold. I sat in the dark, flashlight in hand, watching the shadows move just beyond the cabin. Then, the sound of something dragging on the ground. Something heavy. It moved slowly around the side of the cabin, making a soft scraping noise against the dirt. My breath caught and I froze. The scraping stopped suddenly, and all was silent again. I forced myself to stand, heart hammering. I had to check the perimeter, see what was out there. I grabbed the biggest stick I could find, something sturdy for protection, and quietly opened the door. The cold night air hit me like a wave. The forest was black and still except for the stars above. I stepped down carefully onto the porch, every muscle tense. I shone the flashlight around, sweeping the beam over the trees and ground. The side of the cabin was just a few feet away, and I saw deep marks gouged into the wood, scratches long and deep, as if made by sharp claws or a heavy tool. Some of the wood was splintered. I followed the marks with the light, tracing them down to the ground. There were tracks too, large, uneven footprints pressed into the dirt. I knelt to look. They were too big to be human, more like something with heavy paws. Maybe a bear? But bears don't usually come this close to cabins, and I hadn't seen one in the area. My skin crawled. I stood up and slowly made my way around the cabin, shining the light everywhere. The footprints circled around the building, leading into the woods on the far side. The scratching marks were worse there, the bark stripped off a small tree, torn and shredded. My heart was racing now, the weight of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just an animal passing through. Something had been here, inspecting the cabin, maybe even trying to get in. I thought about calling for help, but there was no phone signal, no neighbors for miles. I was alone, and whatever had been here was still out there. I returned to the porch and shut the door quietly, locking it. I checked the windows. Most were old and fragile, no locks. I jammed a chair against one just in case. Back inside, I built the fire back up, the warm glow pushing the cold shadows away. I kept the flashlight close and stayed awake for hours, listening. Every small noise made me jump. The creak of wood settling, the whisper of wind through the trees, the distant howl of an animal. Around 3 a.m., the scratching started again, this time on the roof. Slow, heavy scrapes like claws raking across the shingles. I pressed my back against the door, trying to calm my breathing. The noise lasted maybe 10 minutes, then stopped. When dawn finally came, pale and gray, I was still awake, exhausted but unable to sleep. I packed my things quickly, fueled by adrenaline and fear. Before leaving, I walked cautiously around the cabin again, searching for any sign of what had been here overnight. The tracks led deeper into the woods, disappearing where the dirt met a rocky slope. I climbed into my truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. The old truck growled to life, and I drove away from that cabin as fast as I dared on the rough road. It was hours later, safely back in town, before my hands stopped shaking. I never went back to that cabin. The forest is beautiful, but it's also wild and unpredictable. That night taught me that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're real, and they're out there watching and waiting in the dark. I don't know exactly what came to my cabin that night. Maybe a bear or something bigger or someone who shouldn't have been there. But I do know I was lucky to get away unharmed. And that's enough. I never planned to spend the night in that cabin, but life has a way of forcing decisions on you when you least expect it. It started on a late autumn afternoon when the sun was already dipping low behind the trees. I was driving home from a week-long business trip, trying to get back to the city before dark. The route I took cut through a stretch of countryside that was dense with forests and scattered farms, the kind of place where cell service disappears, and you have to rely on good instincts. The The sky was overcast, heavy with clouds that looked ready to burst. The wind was picking up, shaking loose the last stubborn leaves from the trees, scattering them like dried scraps of paper across the empty road. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter as I drove, trying to keep my focus despite the growing storm. Halfway through the drive, I noticed a sign that read, "Whispering Pines Cabins," with an arrow pointing down a gravel side road. I had no intention of stopping. My plan was to push through and reach the main highway before nightfall. But the car started making a strange grinding noise. At first, I thought it was just the rough gravel under my tires, but it quickly became clear something was wrong. The engine sputtered, and the dashboard lights flickered. I pulled over to the side of the road just as a few heavy raindrops began to fall. The grinding noise turned into a low growl, then silence. The car wouldn't start again. I tried the ignition a few times, each attempt draining the battery a little more, but nothing happened. I sat there, heart pounding, realizing I was stranded miles from anywhere with a storm closing in fast. The gravel road I had passed looked more like a narrow dirt track, twisting through thick woods with no visible houses or signs of life. I grabbed my phone, hoping for a signal. Nothing, not even a bar. The wind was getting louder, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine needles. Looking around, I saw a wooden sign near the edge of the road that pointed down a short path to Cabin 7. I decided to take a chance. Maybe someone was there who could help or at least let me wait out the storm. The rain started in earnest, pounding the roof of the car and soaking everything in minutes. I grabbed my jacket and headed down the path, the gravel crunching under my boots. The forest closed in quickly on both sides. The trees were tall, dark, and thick, their branches tangled like the fingers of giant hands. The only sound besides the rain was the steady drip of water falling from leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The path wound downhill, and after about 10 minutes, I saw the cabin. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs, with a single window faintly glowing from the inside. A stone chimney puffed a thin line of smoke into the gray sky. The porch was cluttered with some old chairs and a rusty metal lantern that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. The wind caught the door, making it creak open a few inches. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. The air was cold and damp, filled with the smell of wood smoke and mildew. The cabin was sparsely furnished. An old wooden table with 2 chairs, a small fireplace with ashes cold and gray, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. A faded rug covered the floor, stained and worn. Dust floated in the shafts of fading light from the window. I set my wet jacket on the chair and started looking for anything useful. Maybe some matches or a flashlight. I found a box of old matches in a drawer and a half-empty lantern on a shelf, but no fuel. There was a pile of firewood stacked near the fireplace, covered in dust but dry enough to burn. Outside, the rain was still falling hard, the wind howling through the trees like a chorus of lost voices. The sky was almost black now, and the only light came from the cabin's weak window and the occasional flash of distant lightning. I decided to try lighting a fire. The wood smelled dry enough, and the matches were brittle but usable. After a few tries, I got a small flame going in the fireplace. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the rough walls. The warmth was a relief. As I settled in, I noticed the cabin creaking and groaning with the wind. The old wood expanded and contracted, making noises that sounded like whispers or distant footsteps. My mind started playing tricks on me. I moved toward the window, wiping the fog away with my sleeve. The rain had led up to a drizzle, but the darkness outside was thick. Beyond the small clearing where the cabin sat, the trees looked like giant black shapes, their branches scraping against each other. Something about the way the shadows shifted made my stomach tighten. I was alone, no phone signal, no way to call for help. The nearest town was at least an hour away by car, and my own car was dead. The storm was still raging, and the forest outside looked like it could swallow me whole. I tried to focus on the fire, the only thing keeping the cold and darkness at bay. But the silence was heavy, the kind of silence that feels like the world is holding its breath. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside, a faint crack, like a branch snapping under the weight of something. I froze, staring into the dark window, straining to see. The trees swayed in the wind, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. My heart pounded louder than the rain. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a deer or some other animal, but the feeling didn't leave. I checked the locks on the door and windows, even though I was pretty sure the door wasn't locked in the first place. I sat back down near the fire, trying to calm down. But then, another sound came, a low, guttural growl, barely audible but definitely there. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It was closer than before, just outside the cabin. I grabbed a heavy piece of firewood from the hearth and held it ready. The growling grew louder, mixed with the crunching of leaves and dirt under heavy feet. My mind raced with possibilities. Bears weren't common this far south, but wolves or coyotes might roam this area. The fire flickered, and the shadows danced on the walls. The noise stopped suddenly, replaced by silence more frightening than the growls. Minutes passed, each one stretching endlessly. I stayed crouched by the fire, listening. Then, just as I started to think the creature had moved on, I heard a loud thud against the cabin wall, like something heavy hitting the wood. I jumped up, moving toward the sound, firewood raised. My breath came out in short, sharp bursts. Another thud, this time on the door. Something was trying to get in. Panic surged through me. The cabin was old but solid, made of thick logs. But I didn't know what was outside or how long it might try to break in. I looked around desperately for anything to barricade the door. The chairs were old and rickety, but I shoved one under the doorknob. It didn't feel like much. The banging continued, more urgent now, each hit echoing through the cabin. I could smell the faint scent of wet fur and something else, something musky and raw. Suddenly, the thudding stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I waited, heart racing, unable to tell if it was safer to stay or try to escape. Then, as if on cue, a different sound came, a soft scratching noise at the window. The glass rattled. I rushed over and peered out but saw nothing, only the dark forest and the rain. I pressed my hands against the window frame, trying to steady my shaking body. The scratching stopped. Then I heard footsteps moving away, crunching on gravel, fading into the night. I waited long after the noises stopped, until the first light of dawn filtered weakly through the trees. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean but eerily quiet. When I finally stepped outside, the ground was soft and muddy, marked with prints. Large paw prints leading away from the cabin, deeper into the woods. I walked back up the path to my car, hopeful it might start with the storm over. To my surprise, the engine turned over after a few tries. I didn't stop to think or look back. I drove as fast as I dared, my eyes scanning the woods for any sign of movement. By the time I reached the highway, the sun was rising, and the forest looked peaceful again. But I knew what I had heard, what had tried to get inside that night, was very real. It wasn't a ghost or a fairy tale, just a wild creature, driven hungry and desperate by the storm and the changing season. From then on, I never took that shortcut again, and I never forgot how close I came to being trapped in that cabin with something I didn't want to meet in the dark. The hunting cabin sat deep in the woods, tucked away where the trees grew thick and the dirt roads faded into nothing but ruts and broken branches. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden structure built by my grandfather decades ago, with rough-hewn logs and a creaky porch that always sagged a little on one side. Every year, I made the long drive out there, packed my gear, and spent a few days away from everything. No internet, no cell signal, just the quiet of the forest and the sound of the wind in the pines. This time, I arrived late in the afternoon, with the sun starting to dip low behind the hills. The dirt road was bumpy and overgrown, and my truck kicked up dust as I rolled along. When I pulled up to the cabin, the air smelled like pine needles and wet earth, mixed with the faint, smoky scent of last year's campfire still lingering around the fire pit. I parked, climbed out, and took a deep breath. The forest around me was thick, tall trees casting long shadows, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a crow. The cabin looked just the same as it always did, weathered and worn but standing firm. The porch creaked as I stepped onto it, the wood rough under my boots. I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The cabin was small, with a single room that served as kitchen, living area, and sleeping space all in one. A wood stove sat against one wall, blackened from use, and there was a table with a few old chairs, some shelves lined with cans and boxes of supplies, and a small bed in the corner covered with a thick wool blanket. I set my pack down and went straight to the woodpile. I stacked a few logs into the stove and struck a match. The fire caught quickly, filling the room with warmth and a soft orange glow. The cabin felt cozy, even if it was a bit drafty near the windows. I went outside to gather some more firewood before night fully fell, grabbing an axe and a lantern from the porch. The woods around me were alive in the fading light. Birds called from high branches, and small animals darted through the underbrush. I moved quietly, chopping wood and stacking it near the door. The smell of fresh pine filled the air. As the sun slipped below the horizon, the forest changed. Shadows deepened, colors drained away, and the sounds of day faded into the quiet stirrings of night creatures. I went back inside, closed the door tight, and locked it. There was no electricity, so I lit some candles and set them around the room. I prepared a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, eating slowly by the firelight while the wind began to howl outside. The cabin creaked as the night wind pressed against the logs, making me feel small and alone in the vast woods. After eating, I cleaned up and laid out my bedroll on the floor near the stove. I sat for a while, staring into the fire, feeling the steady crackle of burning wood and the cold night pressing just beyond the walls. Then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, deer or raccoon, moving through the underbrush, but the steps were too heavy and slow to be a small animal. They were deliberate, steady, and coming closer. I froze, listening hard. The footsteps stopped near the cabin, and I heard the faint scrape of something dragging across the dirt just beyond the porch. My heart started to pound. I grabbed my hunting knife from the table and moved quietly to the window, peering out through the dim light. The lantern on the porch was swinging gently in the breeze, casting long shadows. The yard looked empty. I waited, holding my breath. Then the sound started again, slow, heavy footsteps circling the cabin, moving out of sight around the back. I thought about calling someone, but there was no signal, no way to reach out. The forest felt vast and dark, the shadows thick and deep. Whoever or whatever was out there could be watching, waiting. I sat back down near the fire, trying to calm myself. I knew it could be a hunter, someone else out in these woods, maybe a lost hiker, or a neighbor from a nearby property. But it was late and no one else was supposed to be around. The cabin was miles from the nearest road that others used, and I hadn't heard or seen anyone on the drive-in. I tried to focus on the fire, on the warmth and the small circle of light inside the cabin. But the footsteps returned, this time faster, heavier, pacing around the porch like they were searching for something. I felt my skin prickling with cold sweat. I checked the locks on the doors and windows again, made sure everything was secure. The woods outside felt like a wall closing in. Then the knocking started, soft, slow, deliberate, on the cabin door. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 3 more. It wasn't loud, but it was steady and firm. I didn't answer. My hands were shaking. The knocking stopped, and silence fell again. I waited, listening to my own breathing. Minutes passed. The wind outside seemed to grow stronger, howling through the trees, and the fire flickered and danced. I thought about grabbing my flashlight and stepping outside to see what was going on, but something held me back. The darkness beyond the door wasn't just empty. It felt alive, watching. I moved to the window again, peering out. The yard was empty, but then I saw a shape moving among the trees. A dark figure stepping between trunks, pausing, then vanishing deeper into the forest. I swallowed hard, feeling the cold grip of fear tightening around my chest. I turned away, pulled the blanket tight around me, and sat by the fire, keeping my knife close. The night stretched on, the wind moaning and the cabin creaking. Every time I thought I heard footsteps or a rustle outside, I'd freeze, heart racing. Hours passed. Eventually, exhaustion began to pull at me. I fought the urge to sleep, knowing I needed to stay alert. But sleep came anyway, brief and restless, filled with dreams of shadows closing in. Morning came slowly, the sky lightening from black to dark blue, then pale gray. I opened the door carefully and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp. The yard was undisturbed. No footprints in the dirt or signs anyone had been near. The forest looked peaceful in the daylight, the trees tall and still. I sat on the porch for a long time, trying to shake the feeling from the night. The sounds of birds waking filled the air, and a thin mist curled around the trunks. I thought about packing up and leaving, but something kept me there. The cabin was mine, a place to be alone, to find quiet, to remember simpler times. I made a fire again, cooked breakfast, and spent the day checking traps and scouting nearby. Nothing strange happened. No footsteps, no sounds. Just the forest, the sun filtering through leaves, and the slow, steady rhythm of nature. When night came again, I stayed inside, double-checked the locks, and kept the fire burning bright. I never heard the footsteps or knocks again. The next morning, I packed my gear and drove back down the road, the forest behind me quiet and still. I knew the woods held their secrets, and sometimes, being alone out there meant facing things you couldn't explain. But the fear I felt wasn't from ghosts or stories. It was real, a cold reminder that the world beyond the cabin was wild and unpredictable, and that sometimes the scariest thing is just being alone with the dark. The sun was already sinking low when I pulled up the dirt road that led to my cabin. It's a modest place, nothing fancy, but it's mine. A single-story wooden cabin with a porch that runs the length of the front, overlooking the edge of the forest. The paint was faded from years of sun and rain, and some of the boards creaked when the wind blew through. It sat alone, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush that smelled of damp earth and pine needles. I had spent many weekends here, escaping the noise of the city, finding quiet in the wilderness. But this time, something felt different. The evening air was crisp and cool, with a faint hint of smoke from the fire pit near the porch. I carried my bags inside, setting down my gear on the small kitchen table that doubled as a workspace and eating area. The cabin's interior was simple. A small kitchen with a stove and sink, a living area with a worn-out couch and a wood stove in the corner, a bed pushed into the far room, and shelves lined with books and supplies. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I stacked firewood by the door, the smell of fresh-cut pine filling the room as I worked. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, making the branches tap softly against the windows. It was the kind of sound that usually felt comforting here, but tonight it made me uneasy. The woods beyond the cabin had always been a place of peace, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just the wild animals settling in for the night, or the loneliness making my mind play tricks. I lit a fire in the stove and sat down with a mug of coffee, the amber glow casting shadows on the wooden walls. The windows were clear, and through them, I could see the darkness thickening in the forest. The stars were just starting to come out, tiny pinpricks in the sky. I tried to focus on a book, but my eyes kept darting to the windows. Every now and then, the shadows seemed to shift in ways that didn't match the wind. I told myself to calm down, that there was nothing out there but trees and maybe a deer or two. After a while, the fire in the stove died down to glowing embers, and the cabin grew colder. I added more wood, watching the flames flare up, then settled in for the night. The wind outside had picked up, making the cabin's old frame groan and creak. It was normal for the cabin to make noise, but tonight, every sound seemed sharper, more deliberate. Later, as I was about to crawl into bed, I noticed a faint smell of smoke lingering in the air. It wasn't coming from inside the cabin. I stepped outside, the cool air biting at my skin, and looked toward the woods. The fire pit was still smoldering, but the smoke I smelled seemed to come from deeper in the forest. A thin column of smoke rose in the distance, twisting into the darkening sky. At first, I thought maybe someone was camping nearby, but this place was remote, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The thought made me uneasy. I scanned the treeline, trying to catch any sign of light or movement, but there was nothing. The forest was dark and silent, except for the whisper of the wind and the occasional snap of a twig. I closed the door behind me and locked it, then double-checked the windows. The cabin felt small and vulnerable, like it was holding its breath. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably a controlled fire, maybe a hunter burning brush, but the smell and the smoke were too close, too intentional. The night stretched on, and I lay awake listening to the sounds outside. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made my heart skip. The wind had died down, and the silence felt heavier. I heard a faint scratching noise near the back of the cabin, like something rubbing against the wood. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound stopped. Then, after a few minutes, it started again, soft but persistent. I grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table and crept to the window. Peering out into the darkness, I could see nothing but the thick shadows of trees and bushes. The beam of the flashlight cut through the black, but the light didn't catch anything moving. The noise stopped as soon as I pointed the light toward the back porch. I shook my head, trying to stop the rising tension in my chest. I knew there were animals around, raccoons, deer, maybe even a fox or two, but the sound didn't fit any animal I knew. It was slow, deliberate, like nails scraping wood. I stayed up the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, listening and watching. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel near the front of the cabin. I froze, heart pounding. The noise stopped, and the forest went quiet again. By dawn, I was exhausted but still alert. The smoke in the distance had faded, and the forest was bathed in a soft morning light. I stepped outside, the cold morning air biting at my cheeks. The fire pit was cold and empty. There was no sign of a campfire anywhere near the smoke I'd seen the night before. I checked the perimeter of the cabin carefully. The ground was damp from last night's dew, and the soil was soft. Near the back porch, I noticed scratch marks on the wooden siding, fresh and rough. They looked like someone or something had clawed at the wood. Not animals, I would have seen tracks or scat. But there was nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks, no signs of a human or animal passing close by. That day, I stayed busy repairing the porch boards and stacking more wood. I kept the doors locked and the windows closed. As the sun moved across the sky, I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. But every time I looked toward the trees, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. That evening, I prepared a big fire in the pit and sat near it, the orange flames casting flickering light across the clearing. The fire's warmth was comforting, but the shadows beyond it were deep and thick. I kept my eyes on the edge of the trees, watching for any sign of movement. As the night grew darker, the scratching started again, this time from the front porch. I gripped a sturdy branch I'd found earlier, holding it tightly. The noise grew louder, and I could hear heavy breathing nearby, too deep and ragged to be an animal. The hair on my arms stood up. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows. Not clearly, just a dark shape against the darkness, tall and still. My heart jumped, but I didn't move. I shone my flashlight toward the figure. It vanished, like it had melted back into the night. I ran to the cabin and bolted the door, heart hammering. I called the sheriff on my phone. No signal. I tried again. Still nothing. The isolation hit me hard then, no help, no one around for miles. All night, I stayed awake, flashlight and makeshift weapon ready. The noises came and went, footsteps circling the cabin, scratching, heavy breathing, but no one ever tried to break in. It felt like whoever or whatever was out there was testing me, watching me, keeping just out of reach. By the time dawn broke, I was drained. I packed up what I could, loading everything into my truck as quickly as I could. I kept glancing nervously into the trees, half expecting to see that dark shape again. When I finally pulled away down the dirt road, I glanced back once. The cabin sat quiet, surrounded by the towering pines, the forest swallowing it whole. I didn't look back again. I still don't know what was out there that night. There were no signs left after I left. No footprints, no broken branches, no stolen items. It was like the forest had swallowed it all up, erased any proof that I hadn't just imagined it. But I never went back. The cabin that once meant peace and solitude became a place I couldn't bear to be. Some things in the woods don't want you there, and sometimes it's better not to find out why. I didn't expect much when I booked the cabin. It was one of those places you find by chance. A tiny, rough-hewn cabin sitting on the edge of a forest deep in the mountains. Nothing fancy, just 4 walls, a rusty wood stove, and a couple of creaky beds. I went there to get away from everything, the noise, the city, the endless obligations. I wanted quiet. I wanted nothing but the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional call of a bird. The drive there was long and winding, the road narrowing until it turned into dirt and gravel. I'd been told there wasn't much cell service, maybe a little patchy at best, but that was part of the appeal. No distractions, no buzzing phones, no people. When I arrived, the sun was already dipping behind the pines, throwing long shadows across the uneven ground. The air smelled sharp and clean, like pine needles and earth. I parked my car near the edge of a small clearing. The cabin sat just a little way back, nestled between towering firs. It looked abandoned at first glance, weathered by years of storms and winter snow, but solid. Inside was dusty but dry. A layer of leaves and dirt had blown in through the cracks, and a few spider webs hung in corners, but the stove looked like it still worked. The windows were grimy but intact. I set down my bag, lit the stove, and sat by the small table. Outside, the forest was growing darker, and the silence was thick, heavier than I'd expected. That first night, I felt a strange unease settle over me. Not the kind that comes from being alone in the woods, but something more specific, like the forest was watching, waiting. At first, I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, maybe the cold creeping in through the cracks. I kept the fire going and read by flashlight until late. Outside, the wind picked up, stirring the needles on the trees and rattling the cabin's loose shutters. Somewhere not far, a branch cracked sharply. I froze, listening. The sound came again, a soft thud, like something large moving carefully through the underbrush. I stood up, moving toward the window with the flashlight, shining out into the dark woods. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and the glint of moonlight on leaves. Then, a shape moved between 2 trees, low, almost crouching. It didn't run, didn't sprint away, just slipped like a shadow. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart picked up, but I told myself it was probably a deer or a fox. The woods were full of animals. Still, something about the way it moved didn't sit right. Over the next day, I explored the nearby trails. The forest was dense and silent, except for birds and the occasional scurry of small animals. I didn't see anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, the wind died down. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I sat outside the cabin, smoking a cigarette, looking up at the stars. The air was cold and sharp, and I was glad I'd brought plenty of wood for the fire. Then, I heard it, a soft, guttural noise, almost like a growl, but too low to be from a regular animal. I froze, eyes scanning the tree line. The sound came again, closer this time. I stood and shined my flashlight into the dark. The beam caught eyes, 2 bright, yellow eyes staring back at me from behind a thick tree trunk. The eyes were too big, too close to the ground to be a deer's. Whatever it was watching. It didn't move or blink, just stared. My breath hitched. The hair on my neck stood up. I slowly stepped back toward the cabin door, and the eyes disappeared. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump. The wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere, something heavy shifted in the brush. On the 3rd day, I decided to leave the cabin for a while, to clear my head. I packed a small bag, left the stove going, and started walking down the trail toward the nearest town, about 15 miles away. I wanted to call someone, anything, to feel less alone. As I walked, the forest grew thicker. The trail was narrow and winding, with gnarled roots snaking across the ground. Birds flew up from the undergrowth, startled by my presence. Halfway through the hike, I stopped to rest by a small creek. The water was cold and clear. I knelt to drink, then noticed strange tracks pressed into the muddy bank. They were too big to be a dog's, but too small for a bear's. The toes were long and clawed, and the prints seemed to lead upstream. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The tracks were fresh. I looked around, trying to catch sight of the creature that made them. The woods were still, but I could feel eyes on me. Suddenly, a sharp crack sounded behind me. I spun around. There was nothing but trees and shadows. I hurried back to the cabin, the sun sinking lower, and a deep unease settled over me. That night, something was different. The woods were alive with noise, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and that low growl again. I stayed inside, bolting the door and windows, but every so often, I heard a heavy step against the cabin walls, like something large was pacing outside. I dared not open the door. When morning came, I went outside cautiously. The ground around the cabin was disturbed, as if something had been digging or clawing at the earth. The bark on several nearby trees was shredded. Jagged tears gouged deep and fresh. I found more tracks around the cabin. Huge, clawed prints, some smeared and some clear. I realized I wasn't dealing with any ordinary animal. The way the thing moved, low, careful, almost human-like in its stealth, made no sense for a wild creature. I gathered my things and packed the car, determined to leave. But as I started the engine, something large stepped onto the road ahead. I froze. It was a figure, but it wasn't right. The legs were too long and bent in a strange way, like a bird's. The skin was rough and mottled, almost like bark or cracked leather. The head was twisted, animalistic but not fully a beast. It stared at me with those yellow eyes, unblinking and cold. The thing tilted its head, then turned and vanished into the trees. I didn't wait to see if it came back. I drove off fast, glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see it following. But it stayed in the woods, watching. I haven't been back. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from any town or neighbor. I found it by chance while scrolling through a rental site, an old wooden cabin on the edge of a forest, surrounded by tall pines and a small clearing just big enough for a fire pit. The pictures looked inviting, rustic but cozy, with a stone chimney, a porch with a few rocking chairs, and windows that promised a view of the quiet forest beyond. I wanted to get away for a few days, just me and nature, no distractions. I booked it, packed a small bag, and left town early one Friday morning. The drive was long, winding through narrow, two-lane roads lined with trees that grew so close to the edge they seemed to lean over the road like silent watchers. The last few miles were on gravel and dirt, the car rattling over potholes and loose stones. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked even better than in the pictures. It was quiet, peaceful, and I felt a strange kind of relief just pulling up to it. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees as I parked. I stepped out and took a deep breath. The air smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and something faintly sweet, like wildflowers hidden under the forest floor. No cars, no people, just the sound of wind in the branches and birds settling down for the night. The forest seemed vast, stretching out in every direction, thick and darkening as the light faded. I unlocked the door, which creaked open on rusty hinges. Inside, the cabin was small but warm. The wooden floorboards were worn, the walls lined with shelves holding old books and a few dusty knickknacks. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a small kitchen with basic appliances sat tucked into a corner. There was a single bed covered with a rough patchwork quilt and a small table with a flickering lamp. The windows showed the darkening woods outside, the tall trees just beyond the porch. I felt comfortable here. I unpacked my things slowly, savoring the quiet. I lit a small fire in the fireplace, the flames crackling and casting flickering shadows on the walls. I made a simple dinner on the stove, pasta and canned sauce, and ate while watching the fire. The silence was complete, broken only by the occasional pop of burning wood and the distant call of an owl. After eating, I sat in one of the rocking chairs on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, staring out into the forest. The stars were bright, and the sky was clear. The woods looked peaceful in the moonlight, the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. I felt a calmness I hadn't known in a long time, but as the night wore on, that calmness began to shift. I was just about to head inside when I heard it, soft at first, barely audible over the wind. A rustling, like branches scraping together, something moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. I paused, listening. The noise stopped. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably just a deer or some small animal. The woods were full of them. I went inside and locked the door. The cabin felt smaller now, the shadows deeper. I tried to read by the fire, but the flames seemed restless, casting strange shapes on the walls. Every time the wind gusted outside, it sounded like a whisper, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Around midnight, I was in bed, the quilt pulled up to my chin, when I heard it again, this time unmistakably outside the cabin. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth just beyond the windows. My heart started to race. I told myself it was nothing, probably a raccoon or a stray dog, but the steps didn't sound like any animal I knew. They were too heavy, too steady. I lay still, listening as the footsteps moved from one side of the cabin to the other, scraping softly on the wooden porch. Then the sound stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing else came. I tried to calm down, telling myself the forest had many noises, and I was just unused to them. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every crackle from the fire, felt amplified. I stayed awake until the fire died down and the first light of dawn slipped through the windows. When morning finally came, I went outside to check the porch. The ground was soft from overnight dew, but there were no footprints, no signs of anyone or anything having been there, just the usual scattered leaves and pine needles. Still, the night had left a lingering unease. I spent the day exploring the nearby woods, trying to shake off the feeling. The forest was beautiful in the daylight. Bright green moss covering rocks, sunlight filtering through leaves, birds hopping on the ground. I walked down a narrow path that led to a small creek, where the water was clear and cold. I filled my water bottle and sat on a rock for a while, listening to the babble of the stream. But even in the daylight, something felt off. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of birds and insects faded until all I could hear was the crunch of my boots on dead leaves. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I wanted to admit. Back at the cabin, I made a small fire again and cooked dinner. The sun set early in these woods, and darkness came fast. As night fell, the forest seemed to close in around the cabin. I kept the fire going, but the flames didn't chase away the cold feeling crawling over my skin. Then I heard it again. This time, the footsteps weren't outside the porch. They were closer. I could hear the soft scraping of nails or claws on the wooden floor just beneath my window. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed very still, staring at the window. The fire flickered low. Suddenly, a shadow moved past the window. Just a flash, but it was enough. I jumped up and pulled the curtains closed, locking the windows and doors again. My hands shook. I sat down, clutching a heavy flashlight I'd brought, shining it at every dark corner of the cabin. I stayed up most of the night, listening. The footsteps came and went, sometimes slow and heavy, sometimes light and fast. Once, I heard a low growl outside the door. It wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I recognized. It sounded angry, territorial. Morning finally arrived, pale and gray. I opened the door cautiously. There were large footprints in the soft dirt near the porch. Too big for a dog, too round for a deer, with long claws digging into the earth. I took pictures with my phone, my hands still trembling. I packed quickly, deciding not to wait any longer. I wanted to leave, but the dirt road out of the woods was muddy from recent rain, and my car was a small sedan, not built for rough terrain. I worried I might get stuck. I started the engine, gripping the steering wheel tight, eyes darting to the treeline as I slowly backed onto the road. The forest seemed to watch me, the branches shifting like hands reaching out. Every few seconds, I thought I saw movement just beyond the trees, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. The road was worse than I expected: deep ruts, slick mud, loose rocks. I moved slowly, trying not to spin the tires. Halfway down, I heard the engine sputter, and the car jerked to a stop. My heart sank. I tried to start it again. Nothing. I was stuck. The woods grew darker and colder as the afternoon faded. I sat in the car, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. The trees pressed closer, the wind carrying strange noises. Twigs snapping, low growls, heavy breathing. I felt trapped, helpless. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my backpack, flashlight, and a small hatchet I kept for emergencies. Locking the car, I stepped onto the muddy road, heading toward what I hoped was the main road. The forest was thick, and the path was barely visible. Every step was a struggle through mud and fallen branches. The sounds followed me: snapping twigs, rustling leaves, the occasional heavy breath. I kept looking over my shoulder, but nothing was ever there when I turned. Hours passed. My legs ached. My clothes were soaked with mud and sweat. The sun was almost gone. I realized I was lost. Panic started to set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered the map on my phone from earlier, the general direction I needed to go. I kept walking, deeper into the forest, away from the cabin. Then the noise changed. The footsteps became more deliberate, closer, faster. I heard a snapping branch directly behind me, and without thinking, I broke into a run, stumbling through the underbrush. The breathing was loud now, right behind me. I pushed harder, branches scratching my face and arms. I tripped over a root and hit the ground hard, scraping my hands and knees. Pain shot through me, but I scrambled up, running again. The footsteps slowed, stopped. I risked a glance back and saw nothing. No shadow, no shape, just the dark forest. I kept running until I broke through the trees onto a gravel road. Relief flooded me. I waved my arms, hoping a car might come. Minutes later, headlights appeared. I flagged the car down and climbed in, exhausted and muddy. The driver took me to the nearest town, where I called. I never thought a quiet weekend at a cabin in the woods could turn into something like this. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A chance to get away from the noise of the city, the endless emails, and the constant hum of life that never seemed to stop. The idea was simple: rent a small cabin far out in the forest, spend a few days alone, hiking, reading, and just being with my thoughts. Nothing fancy, no distractions, just peace. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from town, tucked deep inside a national forest I'd only driven through once before. The road was rough, a thin stretch of cracked asphalt lined with towering pine trees on both sides. As I drove, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows that made the trees look like dark giants standing silent and still. My phone had no signal within the last 10 miles, so I didn't bother checking it anymore. That was fine by me. No interruptions. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sky was a deep blue, almost black, with the first stars starting to blink awake. The cabin was small, made of weathered logs, with a rusty tin roof that caught the last light. It looked older than the rental website made it sound, but that just added to the charm. There was a porch wrapped around the front and side, with a simple wooden bench and a fire pit just a few feet away. I parked my car next to the cabin and grabbed my backpack. The air smelled sharp and clean, a mixture of pine needles, damp earth, and something faintly smoky from a distant campfire. Felt good to be out here. Inside, the cabin was basic but cozy. A small kitchen with a propane stove and a cooler, a table with 2 chairs, and a tiny wood stove against the far wall. The furniture was simple: a couple of wooden chairs, a fold-out cot, and some shelves filled with books and a few mismatched dishes. There was an old-fashioned lantern on the table, along with a box of matches. No electricity, no running water, just a pump well outside the back door for drinking water. the owner's note said. I set my things down, lit the lantern, and started a small fire in the stove. As the fire crackled to life, I pulled out the food I'd brought. Some canned beans, bread, cheese, and a few apples. Nothing fancy, but enough to get me through the weekend. I ate slowly, watching the flames dance, the heat warming my fingers. Outside, the night was completely silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. After dinner, I grabbed a blanket and sat on the porch, staring up at the stars. They were bright here, far from the city lights. A thick, shimmering blanket spread across the sky. I felt a calm settle over me. This was what I had come for. Later, when the fire in the stove died down, I crawled into the cot and pulled the blanket over myself. The cabin was cool, but not cold, and the quiet was deep enough to almost feel like a presence. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind moving through the trees. Around midnight, something woke me. I wasn't sure at first what it was. Maybe the creak of the cabin settling, or a small gust rattling the window. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, trying to catch the sound again. Then I heard it. Faint at first, almost like a whisper, but definitely there. The sound of footsteps outside. The porch creaked softly under weight. My heart jumped. I sat up quietly, straining to see in the dark. The lantern had burned out hours ago, and the only light was the faint moon filtering through the windows. Outside, I could just make out the shape of the porch steps. The footsteps came closer, slow and steady. They paused just outside the door. I held my breath, frozen. Then a low sound, a scrape like a boot against the wooden floorboards. I told myself it must be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the footsteps were too heavy, deliberate. No animal walked like that. The sound moved away slowly, back down the steps and into the forest beyond the clearing. I listened, heart pounding, but no more sounds came. I waited for what felt like hours, but sleep wouldn't come. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me tense. The next morning, I went outside to look around. The forest was peaceful in the daylight, as if nothing had happened. But near the porch, I found something strange. A set of footprints in the soft dirt, large, heavy, and human. They led from the edge of the woods across the clearing and stopped just short of the porch. That wasn't the worst part. Closer to the edge of the forest, I found broken branches and crushed undergrowth. Something, or someone, had pushed through the trees here, moving fast and roughly. I took pictures with my phone, hoping to have some evidence in case I needed it. But the signal was still gone and the battery was weak. No way to call for help. I spent the day on edge, double-checking all the locks and making sure the windows were secure. Every noise outside made me jump. The flapping of a crow's wings, the distant bark of a dog, even the wind against the cabin walls. As the sun started to fall again, the quiet darkness came creeping back. I built a bigger fire in the pit, sitting close to the warmth and watching the smoke drift upward. I told myself to stay calm, to not let fear take hold. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they circled the cabin. Heavy steps thudding around the clearing, pausing now and then moving again. I heard the snap of a twig, a slow, deliberate scrape on the wooden siding. I stayed in the corner of the cabin, holding a long kitchen knife I'd found in the drawer. My eyes were wide in the dark, ears straining. The footsteps stopped at the back door. A long silence. Then, a faint tapping, soft, slow, like fingers drumming on wood. My heart raced. I held my breath. The tapping stopped. Footsteps moved away, fading back into the forest. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the knife, my mind racing with all the things I didn't want to imagine. In the morning, I found more evidence, this time worse. On the back door, deep scratches gouged into the wood, as if someone had tried to pry it open. Around the cabin, broken branches, trampled grass, and fresh footprints. I was terrified. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I had no cell signal, no way to call anyone. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the roads were barely passable. So I stayed, trying to keep calm. The next day, I decided to explore the area more, hoping to find a better signal or maybe a road that could lead me out if I needed. I hiked carefully along the tree line, carrying a backpack with water, a flashlight, and my knife. The forest was thick and dark, the trees so tall their tops disappeared into the clouds. Every few steps, I paused to listen for sounds. None. But after about an hour, I came upon something that froze me in place. A small campsite, no more than 100 yards from the cabin. It looked fresh, a fire pit with cold ashes, some scattered trash, and a couple of empty cans. Nearby, a ragged blanket tossed over a log. Footprints led from the camp back into the woods. Someone had been living there, watching me. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and hurried back to the cabin, heart pounding. Back inside, I locked every door and window, pushed furniture against the door, and sat by the fire, waiting for night to pass. That night, I barely slept. I heard the footsteps again, circling the cabin, pausing at the windows, the back door, the porch. Then something new, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the dirt outside. I grabbed the knife, ready to defend myself. But I stayed quiet, hoping they would go away. Hours passed. The noises stopped. When the sun finally rose, I didn't wait. I packed up as fast as I could, loading everything into my car. I left the door open and the lights off, hoping to appear empty. The drive back was tense. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound set my nerves on edge. But I kept going, thinking about the safety of the city and the normal life I'd left behind. When I reached the edge of the forest and my phone buzzed with signal, I called the local ranger station. I told them what happened, described the footprints, the camp, and the scratches on the cabin. They promised to send someone to check it out. It turned out I wasn't the first to have trouble there. Someone or multiple people had been using the woods to hide, sometimes trespassing on properties, sometimes worse. The ranger said that occasionally, homeless people or desperate travelers find these remote spots and live rough for a while. Usually, they don't cause harm, but sometimes their presence can scare or threaten visitors like me. After that, I never went back to that cabin. I still think about those nights sometimes, how close I was to something I didn't fully understand, something dangerous in its own way. Not monsters or ghosts, but real people struggling in the wild, and me caught right in the middle. I learned that nature is peaceful and beautiful, but it's also wild and unpredictable, especially when others share the same space, hidden just beyond the tree. The sky was a dull gray when I first pulled up the gravel driveway to my cabin. It had been a long drive, twisting through endless stretches of pine trees and hills, the kind of trip that left your mind wandering. I'd been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. Time away from the city, away from noise and people. My cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded on three sides by thick forest. It was old, built by someone who loved the woods as much as I did. The wood was weathered, darkened by years of rain and sun, but sturdy. A stone chimney rose on one side, and smoke curled lazily from it as I switched on the old propane heater inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. That deep, earthy scent of pine needles mixed with the faint, dusty smell of old wood and years of sitting untouched during the off-season. I kept the cabin locked tight during the winter, and now that spring had started, I was here to clear out the winter's dust and get ready for summer. The old wooden door creaked when I pushed it open, the sound echoing a little in the quiet. The cabin's interior was simple but cozy. Rough wooden floors, a worn but comfortable couch, a small kitchen with a propane stove, and a hand-built dining table that showed its age with scratches and dents. The windows were dusty but clear enough to see the trees swaying outside. I set my bag down on the floor and moved to light the stove. Took a few tries to get the flame going, but soon the cabin began to warm. Outside, the wind picked up, making the branches scrape softly against the roof. I checked the woodpile stacked near the back door, picking out some logs for the fireplace. The fire slowly caught, crackling and throwing dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls. Sitting back, I breathed in the smoke mixed with the pine smell. This was exactly what I needed. Peace, quiet, and a little time to myself. As evening fell, the gray sky turned a deeper shade of blue. The sun slipped behind the hills, and the forest grew darker, the trees turning into tall, black silhouettes against the dimming sky. I lit the lantern hanging from the ceiling, its yellow glow filling the room with a soft, warm light. The wind outside died down, replaced by an almost heavy silence that made me realize how isolated I really was. No cars, no distant voices, nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves. I made a simple dinner, canned beans and some bread, and ate by the small table. The quiet felt almost unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. Outside, the night deepened. Stars began to poke through the darkening sky, but the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. I finished eating, then moved to close the windows, making sure the cabin was sealed against the cold. That's when I noticed it, a faint noise coming from the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the branches, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. It was a low, dragging noise, like something heavy moving slowly across dry leaves. I stopped what I was doing and listened closely. The sound came again, closer this time, scraping softly against the gravel driveway. My heart quickened, but I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, something about the way it moved didn't sit right. It wasn't a quick, light step like a deer's. It was slow, careful, deliberate. I walked to the window and peered out into the darkness. The trees stood still, shadows stretching long across the clearing. I couldn't see anything. I went back to the fireplace and added more wood. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks into the chimney. I sat down, telling myself to relax. After a while, the noise stopped. Maybe it had been my imagination. I turned the lantern down low and lay back on the couch. The cabin creaked softly as the wood shifted in the cooling night air. Outside, the wind picked up again, making the trees sway and the branches tap against the roof. It was the kind of noise that felt normal out here. Still, I kept my ears open. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. Something had woken me. A sharp sound, a break in the silence. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. The cabin was dark except for the faint light from the dying fire. Outside, the wind had stopped. The forest was still, but there was a sound, faint, but there, scratching, like nails or claws scraping against the wood of the porch. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was slow, steady, and very close. I grabbed my flashlight from the table and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness inside. I moved quietly to the door and peered out. The porch was empty, nothing but shadows and the faint outline of the trees. The scratching stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but the night was silent once again. I closed the door carefully and locked it. Then I double-checked all the windows, making sure they were latched tight. I sat back down, my flashlight still in hand, and stared into the fire. Minutes passed like hours. Every little sound made me jump. A bird calling far away, the creak of a branch, the soft rustle of leaves. I tried to convince myself it was just animals or the wind playing tricks, but the memory of those scratches stayed with me. Eventually, I forced myself to lie down again, the flashlight on the floor beside the couch. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was restless, filled with dreams of shadows moving just beyond the windows, something watching, waiting. Morning came late, the sky gray and overcast. I opened the door and stepped outside, the cold air sharp in my lungs. The forest looked peaceful in the daylight, the trees bright and alive with birdsong. But the porch told a different story. There were scratches on the wood, long thin marks, claw-like and deep. The dirt near the steps was disturbed, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. I knelt and looked closer. Footprints. Large, heavy prints, not like any deer or bear I'd seen before. The toes were long, curved, and sharp. I felt a chill, but I pushed it down. This was the wilderness. Animals lived here. I'd seen bears and wolves on my hikes. Maybe it was a large bobcat or even a mountain lion. Whatever it was, it had come close to the cabin in the night. I spent the day making the cabin feel more secure. I checked the locks, nailed some extra boards over the windows, and built a bigger fire pit just outside, thinking maybe the light and smoke would keep whatever was out there at bay. I didn't want to stay locked inside all weekend, but I wasn't going to be careless either. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to clear, and the sun finally broke through. I took a walk around the clearing, staying close to the cabin. The forest was alive with sounds: birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling in the breeze. But there were no signs of whatever had been here last night. No new tracks, no broken branches. Just the peaceful woods I'd come here to enjoy. That night, I stayed up later, the fire burning bright and the cabin feeling safer with the extra lights on outside. The scratches on the porch still nagged at me, but I told myself to focus on the good. I was here to relax, to escape the city's noise and stress. I fell asleep finally, tired from the day's work and the fresh air. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that sinks deep into your bones. I dreamed of tall trees and clear skies, the forest safe and still. When morning came, I stepped outside again. The porch was untouched, no new scratches or footprints. The sun was warm, the air fresh with the smell of pine and earth. I packed up some things, feeling good about the weekend. The forest was wild, yes, but I was prepared, and the cabin was strong. Whatever had come close in the night hadn't returned. I locked the door behind me as I left, turning back for one last look at the cabin. It stood quietly among the trees, a small refuge in the vast wilderness. The scratches on the porch were a reminder that nature was never fully tamed, but also a sign that I could handle whatever came my way. Driving back down the gravel road, the city lights began to twinkle ahead. I felt a strange mix of relief and gratitude. Relief to be returning to familiar places, and gratitude for the solitude I'd found in the woods. The cabin was more than a building. It was a place where I could face the wild, find peace, and know I was ready for whatever the forest might bring next time. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a place far away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. It was nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by tall pine trees and a thick underbrush that seemed to swallow the sound of everything outside. The kind of place where your phone loses signal as soon as you turn off the main road. I packed my car the night before, double-checking every little thing: the camping stove, extra blankets, canned food, a couple of bottles of water. I wasn't planning to rough it completely. I wanted some comfort, but with the feeling of being alone in the wild. The drive there was longer than I thought. Gravel roads wound through hills and patches of woods, the car bumping over uneven ground. As I got closer, the trees grew thicker, the air cooler, smelling like pine needles and earth. The sun was already low by the time I pulled up to the small clearing where the cabin stood. It was an old wooden structure, maybe built in the 50s or 60s, with dark-stained logs and a slanted roof. The porch had a couple of old rocking chairs, and a stack of firewood lay neatly piled beside the door. Everything looked untouched, as if the cabin had been waiting quietly for someone like me. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A small wood stove stood in the corner of the main room, its black metal cold now but promising warmth later. The floor creaked when I stepped on it, and the smell of dust and old wood filled the air. There was a small kitchen area with a sink, a few pots and pans hanging from hooks, and a table covered with a faded checkered cloth. A narrow staircase led up to a loft that served as the bedroom. I unpacked my things slowly, setting out the blankets and unpacking some canned soup. The windows were thin, old glass panes, and through them I could see the trees swaying slightly in the evening breeze. As night fell, the forest grew darker, the shadows thickening outside until I could barely make out the shapes of the trees. The only light came from the small oil lamp I'd brought, casting a soft yellow glow that made the cabin feel warmer. I built a fire in the wood stove, listening to the crackle and pop of the burning logs, the heat slowly spreading through the room. Outside, the forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird calls settling in for the night. The first night passed quietly enough, but I could still feel something different about the place. There was a weight to the silence here, like the forest was watching. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe the fact that I wasn't used to being this alone. Still, every little noise, a branch scraping against the window, the soft creak of the cabin settling, made me jump. The second day, I decided to explore the woods around the cabin. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their trunks thick and covered with moss. The forest floor was soft with fallen needles, broken branches, and patches of dark, damp earth. I walked slowly, noticing how quiet everything was except for the occasional chirp of a bird or the far-off tap of a woodpecker. There were no signs of other people, no footprints or trash, just the untouched wilderness. As I wandered, I came across a small creek, its water clear and cold, bubbling over smooth stones. I knelt to cup my hands and drink, feeling the chill of the water refreshing me in the warm afternoon sun. The light filtered through the trees in golden shafts, creating patches of warmth on the ground. I sat there for a while, letting the quiet surround me, feeling far away from the world I'd left behind. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. Near the edge of the clearing, where the trees met the open space, I found fresh footprints in the soft dirt. They were large, much bigger than mine, and they seemed to come from the forest and head towards the cabin. My heart quickened as I looked closer. The prints were too big to be a dog or any normal animal. They looked almost human, but somehow wider, heavier. I told myself it was probably just a large deer or maybe a bear. I'd seen tracks like this before in the woods near where I grew up. Still, it left me uneasy. I took a flashlight and followed the prints back into the trees, moving carefully, the beam of light scanning over the rough bark and thick underbrush. The tracks stopped suddenly at the base of a large pine tree. There was no sign of anything else, no broken branches, no scuff marks, just the deep impressions in the dirt. That night, I was careful to lock the cabin door and make sure the windows were shut tight. I kept the wood stove burning, the fire giving off a comforting heat. The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose boards on the porch and sending a low moan through the trees. I sat close to the fire, my eyes watching the shadows dance on the walls. At some point, I heard something outside, a low, heavy sound like a breath or a snort. My heart jumped. I turned off the lamp, holding my breath, listening. The noise came again, closer this time, slow and deliberate. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It was heavier, deeper. I could hear the crunch of dry leaves underfoot as something moved just beyond the window. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe. The fire flickered, and in the dark, I thought I could see a shape move outside the window, large and shadowy. It was gone when I blinked. I wanted to get up, to look outside, but my body felt frozen with fear. I waited, counting seconds, until the noise faded, and the forest grew quiet again. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak, every whisper of the wind, sounded like footsteps. I kept the fire going low, the warmth my only shield. When dawn finally broke, the pale light filtered through the trees. I felt some relief. The next morning, I went outside to check the area around the cabin. The footprints were still there, more visible in the damp earth. They circled the cabin, large and deep, as if whatever made them had been pacing, watching. I looked for any other signs, broken branches, scat, anything that could tell me what kind of creature had been there, but found nothing else. I spent the day cleaning up, trying to focus on the tasks at hand, chopping wood, filling the water jug, making sure I had enough food. But the feeling of being watched never left me. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, the power of the forest's silence hit me again. The usual sounds, birds, insects, small animals, were missing. It was like the entire woods were holding their breath. Then I heard it again, the heavy breathing, close, just beyond the trees. This time it was accompanied by the faint sound of something dragging on the ground. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam through the darkness. The beam caught on a pair of eyes, reflecting back at me, large and unblinking. I froze. The eyes vanished behind a tree. I scanned the woods, heart hammering. I heard a low growl, guttural and slow, not quite a bear, not quite any animal I knew. Something heavy crashed through the underbrush, moving fast now, closing in. I ran back inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands trembled as I grabbed the hunting knife I'd packed, the only weapon I had. I pressed my back against the door, listening. The noise circled the cabin, heavy footsteps pacing, snarls cutting through the still night. The fire in the stove was dying, and the cabin grew cold. I wrapped myself in a blanket, knife in hand, eyes fixed on the windows. I didn't dare look outside again. Hours passed. The sounds eventually moved away, but I knew they hadn't gone far. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed my things quickly, not bothering to eat. The footprints were fresh, more numerous than before, leading toward the road. Whatever had come here last night had been circling me all night long. I drove away from the cabin as fast as I could, glancing in the rearview mirror at the dense forest swallowing the clearing. The feeling of being watched faded slowly as the trees gave way to open fields, and the sound of the road filled the car. That trip changed something in me. I learned to respect the silence of the woods, to understand that not all that lives in the forest wants to be found, and that sometimes the real fear isn't from ghosts or stories, but from the quiet, lurking unknown that can be very, very real. It was late October when I decided to spend a weekend alone in a cabin deep in the woods. I needed a break from the city, from the noise, the people, the constant pressure. I wanted silence and solitude, to clear my head and breathe fresh air. The cabin I rented was a small, old wooden structure tucked away near the edge of a dense forest, about 2 hours from the nearest town. It was simple: one room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, a bed pushed against the wall, and a single window that looked out into the trees. I arrived just before sunset, the sky already streaked with shades of orange and pink. The gravel road leading to the cabin had been rough, and my car kicked up dust as I parked near the porch. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. It was quiet in a way that felt almost heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I unlocked the door, stepping inside to the familiar smell of old wood and cold air. The cabin was chilly, but that was expected. I lit the stove and stacked firewood carefully, hearing the soft crackle as the flames began to catch. The night came quickly. After I ate a simple dinner, I sat near the window watching the last light fade, my breath fogging the glass. The woods outside turned into a black wall dotted with the faint shimmer of stars. A cool wind rustled the branches, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out once, then silence again. I was tired, but before going to bed, I decided to walk around the property, to get a feel for the place in the dark. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen shelf, the kind with a narrow beam and a worn grip. The beam sliced through the shadows as I stepped off the porch and onto the soft, mossy ground. The trees stood tall and close, their trunks thick and rough against my skin when I brushed past. The sounds of the forest at night were subtle but alive. The rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig beneath my boots, the occasional rustle of something small moving unseen. As I walked, I noticed how different the forest felt at night. The shapes were strange and unfamiliar. Trees that seemed thin and delicate in daylight now looked like hulking figures. Branches twisted in odd angles, shadows stretched unnaturally long. The path I followed during the day was nearly invisible now, covered by darkness and fallen leaves. I had to be careful with every step. About 15 minutes from the cabin, I came to a small clearing. The moon was thin and high, casting a faint silver light that made the grass glisten with dew. I stopped for a moment, listening to the silence. That's when I heard it, a low, heavy breathing. At first, I thought it was my own, amplified by the quiet. But it wasn't. It was coming from the woods, maybe 30 feet away, somewhere behind a cluster of trees. My heart sped up. I froze, shining my flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness but found nothing. No eyes reflecting back, no movement in the underbrush. The breathing stopped. The silence pressed back in. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the sound had been too deliberate, too close. I turned back toward the cabin, trying to stay calm. The forest seemed different now, like it was watching me, waiting. I quickened my pace, the flashlight beam bobbing as I hurried along the faint trail. The trees closed in on both sides, and the shadows moved as if they were alive. When I finally reached the porch, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I leaned against it, heart pounding, trying to slow my breathing. The cabin felt safe, warm with the fire crackling, but the unease stayed with me. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure they were secure. Then I sat down by the stove, wrapping my hands around a mug of hot tea, staring into the flames. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old window panes. I listened to the night sounds, the rustling leaves, the distant howl of a coyote, the creaking of the cabin settling on its foundations. Every noise felt louder, sharper. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that breathing again, soft and steady, like it was right outside. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift. I kept the fire burning, adding wood when the flames died down. Around midnight, I heard something else, a scratching at the back door. Quiet at first, then more insistent. I froze, listening. The scratching stopped, but I could hear faint footsteps moving away through the leaves and twigs. I wanted to look outside, to see what was there, but I was too afraid. Instead, I grabbed a heavy kitchen knife from the counter and sat near the door, eyes fixed on the window. Time dragged. The night stretched on, filled with small noises that made me jump. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, a distant animal call. I tried to tell myself these were all normal forest sounds, but the scratching at the door kept replaying in my mind. Whoever or whatever was out there knew I was alone. They knew I was vulnerable. Morning came slowly, the sky lightening with pale gray dawn. I opened the door cautiously, knife in hand, scanning the area. The ground was undisturbed except for a few animal tracks I didn't recognize, large and irregular. The back door frame was scratched, deep gouges in the wood. I touched them, feeling the rough splinters. I didn't stay outside long. I needed to pack up and leave, but first, I wanted to understand what had happened. I checked the perimeter, looking for anything unusual. Near the edge of the clearing, I found a patch of trampled grass and broken branches, as if something had been hiding there, waiting. The earth was soft and muddy from recent rain, and I spotted what looked like boot prints. Human, not animal. They led into the forest and stopped suddenly. That was when I realized something else was wrong. My phone, which I'd left charging on the kitchen counter, was missing. I searched the cabin thoroughly, under the bed, behind furniture, in every drawer. It was gone. Whoever had come close enough to scratch the door had been inside, or at least close enough to take it. The feeling of safety I had when I arrived was gone. The forest no longer seemed just a quiet place to rest, but a place where someone else had been watching, waiting. The thought of being alone, without any way to call for help, made the hairs on my neck stand up. I gathered my things quickly, throwing essentials into my bag. I left the fire burning, knowing the cabin would be empty and cold when the next renter arrived. As I stepped onto the porch, I looked around one last time, trying to remember every detail. The way the trees leaned, the shape of the clearing, the pattern of the boot prints. I wanted to make sure I would never come back here alone. The drive back was tense. Every shadow on the side of the road, every sound from the forest made me glance nervously in the rearview mirror. I kept the doors locked and the windows up. When I finally reached the highway and saw other cars, the sense of relief was overwhelming. Back home, I called the cabin owner and told him what happened. He was surprised but not shocked. He said sometimes people come out there for reasons other than hiking or hunting, that the woods weren't always safe, especially at night. I didn't press for details. I just wanted to be away from it all. That weekend in the cabin taught me something important. Nature is beautiful but also wild and unpredictable. And sometimes the real danger doesn't come from the wilderness itself, but from the people who hide inside it. I still think about that breathing, the scratching at the door, the feeling of eyes on me in the dark. It's a memory that doesn't fade easily. Now, whenever I plan a trip to the woods, I'm more careful. I make sure I have a way to call for help, that someone knows where I am, and I never go out alone after dark. That cabin will stay in my mind as a warning. A place where I learned how thin the line is between peace and fear, between solitude and danger. I didn't find out who or what was there that night. Maybe it was someone just passing through, maybe something more. But I know one thing for sure. The forest keeps its secrets well, and sometimes it doesn't want you to leave. The sun was low in the sky as I pulled the car up a narrow, rocky path that twisted through a dense forest. The trees stood tall and close, their trunks thick and bark rough, and their branches tangled overhead, casting long shadows on the ground. I had driven this far to get away from everything: work, noise, people. The small cabin I was renting sat on the edge of a clearing, a quiet spot surrounded on three sides by towering pines and oaks, with a shallow creek running past the front yard. It looked peaceful enough, a perfect place to spend a few days alone. The cabin was old but sturdy, made from dark, weathered logs stacked carefully and sealed with moss and tar. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were small, with faded white curtains. A thin plume of smoke drifted from the stone chimney, curling up into the cooling air. There was a porch with a couple of wooden chairs and a small table, worn smooth from years of use. It smelled faintly of pine sap and dry wood, mixed with the crisp scent of the forest. I got out of the car, stretched, and took a deep breath. The air was cool but fresh, filled with the quiet sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the light breeze, the distant gurgle of the creek. No cars, no voices, just the wild. I grabbed my bag and locked the car, then walked slowly to the porch, feeling the uneven boards creak beneath my boots. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. There was a small living area with a worn sofa and a wooden table, a kitchen corner with a rusty stove, and a single bedroom with a creaky bed covered by a faded quilt. A pile of firewood was stacked near the door, and next to it, a heavy ironwood stove sat cold and dark. I dropped my bag on the floor and opened the windows to let in the fresh air, watching the sun slip lower behind the trees. The light turned golden and soft, making the forest look even more beautiful. I unpacked a few things, pulled some dry wood from the pile, and started a small fire in the stove. The first crackle of flames made the cabin feel warmer and less empty. I moved to the porch and sat in one of the chairs, listening to the creek and watching the shadows stretch across the clearing. The peacefulness was almost overwhelming after the constant noise of the city. Night came quickly, and with it, the forest changed. The air cooled further, becoming damp and heavy with the smell of earth and pine needles. The creek's babble grew louder in the quiet. I stood up and locked the doors, making sure the windows were shut tight. Outside, the darkness was thick, and the trees looked like giant black shapes against the starry sky. Inside the cabin, the fire cast flickering shadows on the walls. I sat close to it, warming my hands and tried to relax. But the quiet was different now, less peaceful and more alerting. Every crack and pop from the fire, every whisper of wind in the trees, sounded sharper. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig outside, or the rustle of leaves, and it made me tense. There was something about being alone in a place like this that made you notice things you'd usually ignore. I moved to the kitchen to prepare some food, just canned beans heated on the stove, but even that felt like a small comfort. I ate slowly, eyes flicking to the window, watching for any sign of movement outside. There was nothing but the black silhouettes of trees, unmoving and silent. Later, I lay down on the bed, the quilt pulled up to my chin. The cabin creaked and sighed as the night deepened. I tried to focus on my breathing, telling myself I was safe, but my mind kept drifting to the sounds outside. There was a subtle shift, a heavier presence in the forest. The rustling was closer now, almost deliberate. I could hear the faint brushing of branches and leaves, something moving softly but steadily. I stayed very still, listening, waiting for whatever it was to show itself. The moments stretched long. Then, very faintly, I heard it, the slow, heavy breathing, coming from just outside the cabin. Not a person's breath, but something larger, heavier. It was steady, deep, and uneven, like a wild animal catching its breath. My heart pounded hard, but I kept quiet. I thought about the animals in the forest, deer, maybe a bear or a wild boar. The idea of a bear so close made my stomach twist. I reached silently for the flashlight on the table and shone it out the window toward the dark. The beam caught something large, just on the edge of the clearing near the porch. I froze. It was the shape of a huge animal, low to the ground, thick and broad. The eyes reflected the light, bright, yellowish, unblinking. It was a bear. I didn't move or breathe. The bear stayed there for a long moment, just watching. Then it let out a low grunt and slowly turned away, disappearing into the forest shadows. I felt my whole body relax a little, but the fear stayed with me. I knew I couldn't just wait for it to come back. I decided to get the heavy kitchen knife I'd brought and keep it close. I also pulled more wood for the fire, making sure it was roaring strong. The firelight pushed the shadows back, but I still felt exposed. The bear was out there, nearby, and I was alone in a small wooden box in the middle of its home. Sleep was impossible. I sat near the fire, watching the windows and listening. The night crept on, cold and endless. Every few minutes, I heard the bear moving outside, its heavy steps crunching on dry leaves and branches. Sometimes it sniffed the air near the cabin, testing for smells. At one point, the bear tried to push against the cabin door, maybe curious or looking for food. The door shook under its weight, loud and frightening. I held the knife tightly, heart racing. But I stayed calm, not making a sound or sudden movement. Eventually, it gave up and moved away again. When dawn finally arrived, the forest changed. The sky brightened with soft pink and orange, and the shadows faded. The bear was gone. I was exhausted but relieved. I opened the door carefully, peeking outside. The clearing was empty, but there were large paw prints in the soft earth by the porch, fresh and unmistakable. I knew then that the bear had been close enough to touch the cabin, and I had been lucky it didn't decide to break in. But I wasn't angry or upset. I felt a strange respect for the creature and the wild place I'd come to. I packed up quickly, wanting to get back to the safety of the road and civilization. As I drove away, the trees fell behind me, and the noise of cars and people filled the air once more. But the memory of the night stayed sharp in my mind. The silence, the shadows, the heavy breathing just outside the window. The forest wasn't just a pretty backdrop for a weekend getaway. It was alive and dangerous, full of things that didn't belong to me. I never went back to that cabin again, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the city, I can still hear the echo of those heavy steps and the quiet presence watching from the darkness. It reminds me that the wild is always waiting, just beyond the edge of the safe, quiet places we call home. I have a small cabin out in the woods, a place I built myself over a few years. It's nothing fancy, just a simple wooden structure with a metal roof, a stone fireplace, and a porch that looks out over the trees. It sits at the edge of a thick forest, far from any roads or neighbors. I've always loved the quiet out there, the way the trees seem to stretch endlessly, the way the wind sounds when it blows through the branches, and the occasional call of an owl or a distant coyote. It feels like a refuge from the noise of the world. I decided to spend a few nights there alone in early October, when the leaves were turning but before the cold really set in. I packed my gear carefully. Some canned food, a sleeping bag, matches, a lantern, and plenty of water. I wanted to get away for a while, to clear my head and enjoy the silence. The cabin has no electricity or running water, so I had to bring everything I needed. The first day was perfect. I drove my truck down the dirt road until I reached the narrow trail that led to the cabin. The last mile was just a rough path through the trees, barely wide enough for the truck. I parked it at the trailhead and carried my bags in by hand. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and damp earth. The sky was clear, and the sun shone through the canopy in golden patches. When I reached the cabin, I was glad to see the porch swing still hanging where I left it. The wood creaked softly when I pushed it. Inside, the cabin was clean but smelled faintly of wood smoke from the last time I'd been there. I started a fire in the stone fireplace, arranging the logs carefully to get a good flame going. The crackling fire warmed the room quickly. That first night, I sat by the fire for a long time, reading a book and sipping hot coffee from my thermos. Outside, the woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the distant hoot of an owl. The sky darkened and the stars appeared, sharp and clear in the cold air. I felt peaceful, like nothing could touch me out here. I went to bed early, rolling out my sleeping bag on the wooden floor next to the fire. I left the fire burning low so it wouldn't go out, and set my lantern on the table. The cabin was warm and cozy, the soft sounds of the fire and the night lulling me to sleep. Around midnight, I woke to a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a branch scraping the cabin wall. But then I heard it again. A soft, slow crunching of footsteps on the dry leaves near the porch. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside. Then there was silence. The fire crackled faintly, and the lantern cast long shadows across the walls. I didn't want to look out the window, but I couldn't stop myself. I eased over to the small glass pane by the door and peeked out. The porch was empty. The trees stood dark and still, their branches silhouetted against the moonlight. There was no sign of anyone, no shape or movement, just the empty night. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. The forest was full of creatures like that. But the footsteps sounded too heavy and deliberate to be a small animal. I tried to calm myself and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. Every sound outside made me jump. I heard twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and once, a low growl that I wasn't sure was an animal or something else. My mind started imagining things I didn't want to think about. I kept checking the windows, but I never saw anything. Still, I felt watched. The next morning, I checked the area around the cabin carefully. I found broken branches and deep footprints in the dirt near the back door. The prints were large, too big to be a deer or any normal animal. They looked like human boots, heavy and worn, with thick treads. They came from the edge of the woods, circled the cabin, and disappeared back into the trees. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. Someone had been here during the night, but there was no sign of forced entry. The door and windows were locked tight. Whoever had been outside hadn't tried to get in. That made me feel both relieved and uneasy. I stayed busy during the day, chopping firewood, cleaning the cabin, and walking the nearby trails. But I kept looking over my shoulder. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful the day before, now felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. That night, I made sure the door was locked and placed a heavy chair against it from the inside. I kept my knife and a flashlight close by and left the lantern off to avoid attracting attention. I sat by the fireplace, listening to the sounds of the night. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time they were slower, closer, and more cautious. I could hear the crunch of gravel and leaves right outside the cabin. Then, a faint tapping at the window nearest the door. A slow, deliberate knock. I didn't move. My heart pounded so loud I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. The knocking came again, then stopped. The footsteps moved away slowly, fading into the dark. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the windows and clutching my knife. In the morning, I found more footprints. They looked fresher, pressed deeper into the soft dirt. But this time, something else caught my eye. An old, rusted knife lying near the side of the cabin. It wasn't mine. I picked it up carefully, noting the worn handle and dull blade. Someone had left it there on purpose, I was sure. A warning? A threat? I felt the walls closing in. The cabin that had once been my sanctuary was now a trap. The woods no longer felt safe. I packed my things quickly, stuffing my bags and grabbing my gear. I didn't want to leave the cabin unlocked or empty, but I had no choice. As I stepped outside, the sun was just rising, casting long shadows between the trees. I looked around one last time. The forest was quiet again, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way. Someone was out here watching, waiting. I locked the door behind me, loaded my gear into the truck, and started down the trail as fast as I could. The footsteps followed me for a while, faint but steady. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the main road, I felt like I could breathe again. The safety of the highway lights and distant houses was a relief. I drove away without stopping, not wanting to think about what might still be out there in the woods near my cabin. Weeks later, I returned with friends and we stayed for a few days. We installed stronger locks, set up motion sensors, and left signs warning trespassers. No one came back that time, but the feeling never really left me. I still love my cabin, and I still go back when I need peace. But I always stay alert now. The woods are no longer just a place of quiet beauty. They are a place where shadows move, where footsteps echo, and where danger can hide just beyond the trees. The old cabin sat at the edge of a thick forest, barely noticeable unless you were really looking for it. I had found it by accident during a long hike a few months earlier, and when I realized it was empty and seemed structurally sound, I made a mental note to come back. I needed a place to get away for a few days, away from the noise of the city, the constant buzz of people and screens. This cabin was perfect. It had that rough, weathered look, wood darkened by years of rain and sun, with a small porch that creaked underfoot. The windows were dusty but intact, and a stone chimney rose from one side, hinting that the cabin had once been a warm place in winter. I arrived late in the afternoon, hauling a pack filled with essentials: water, food, a small stove, matches, a heavy flashlight, and a thick wool blanket. The sun was low, the light turning golden and soft, filtering through the pines and casting long shadows on the ground. The air smelled sharp and clean, the kind of cold that stings your lungs when you breathe deep. The forest around the cabin was dense, full of pine and fir trees, their branches whispering faintly in the breeze. The ground was uneven, littered with pine needles and broken twigs. I stepped carefully as I approached the porch, feeling the wood groan slightly beneath my boots. I pushed the door open, surprised that it swung wide without resistance. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of damp wood and dust, like a place untouched for years but not entirely abandoned. There was a small wood stove in the corner, some old chairs, and a wooden table scarred with scratches and stains. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the single window gave a view of the trees outside, their branches swaying and blocking most of the fading light. I set down my pack and went to work gathering dry wood from a pile nearby, careful to avoid the damp logs hidden beneath the loose bark and moss. Starting a fire was harder than I expected. The wood was older than it looked, and the dampness made the kindling stubborn. My hands shook a little as I struck the matches, trying not to get discouraged. When the fire finally caught, flames flickering and casting a warm orange glow, I felt a small surge of satisfaction. I sat back in one of the creaky chairs, watching the firelight dance on the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and sending a cold draft through the cracks in the cabin walls. The sun disappeared behind the hills, and darkness settled like a heavy blanket. I flicked on my flashlight and checked my gear again. I had enough food for 2 days, a full water bottle, and my phone, though I didn't expect to get any signal out here. As the night deepened, the sounds of the forest came alive. The distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig, and the whisper of the wind through the branches. It was peaceful but also a little unnerving. Out here, you felt small, like the forest was watching, waiting. I tried to sleep early but found it difficult. Every noise seemed amplified. The creak of the floor, the sigh of the wind, the scurrying of small animals outside. At one point, I thought I heard something heavier than a squirrel, maybe a deer or a bear moving near the edge of the clearing. My mind started to wander. What if I wasn't as alone as I thought? What if someone else was out here watching the cabin, waiting? The idea felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake it. I kept the flashlight close and my pocket knife even closer. Hours passed. I dozed in and out of sleep, always waking at the slightest sound. Around midnight, I heard it clearly. A series of heavy footsteps crunching on the dry leaves outside the cabin. They weren't slow and careful like an animal, but deliberate and steady. My heart pounded, and I sat frozen, listening as the steps circled the cabin once, then stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rough bark of the trees, the empty clearing around the cabin. Nothing. No figure, no movement, just the trees swaying in the breeze. The footsteps started again, this time heading away, retreating into the darkness. I stayed alert until dawn, the fire long gone cold, until the first pale light of morning crept through the window. I knew I couldn't stay another night without finding out who or what had been outside. I packed my things quickly and stepped outside, looking carefully around the cabin's perimeter. The ground was soft from a recent rain, and there, near the edge of the trees, I saw it. Footprints. Big human footprints, heavy and uneven, as if someone was tired or carrying something heavy. They hadn't come from the nearby trail, which was too far away, and there were no other signs of a camp or fire. That was the moment I decided to leave. I didn't feel safe here anymore, not in the way I had when I first arrived. The forest was too quiet now, too empty, like it was holding its breath. I walked back along the trail toward the road, my pace quickening as the sun climbed higher, chasing away the shadows. When I finally reached my car, I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. The cabin had seemed like a refuge, a place to breathe and be alone. But out here, alone wasn't always safe. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following behind me. But the road was empty, the forest thick and still. By the time I reached the nearest town, the unease had faded a little, replaced by the ordinary noise and light of civilization. I promised myself I wouldn't go back to that cabin. Some places are better left alone, their secrets buried in the shadows of the trees. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a quiet escape from the constant noise of the city, a break from work, and the perfect chance to get away from everything. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but the forest stretching out all around it. Just me and a couple of old friends, all eager to reconnect and relax for a few days. The drive up had been long but scenic. We passed rolling hills and quiet, winding roads that seemed to get narrower with every turn, until we finally reached the cabin. It was a small, rustic place, with peeling wood on the outside and a steep, pitched roof that looked like something out of an old postcard. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, but not in the kind of way that makes you run in fear. It was charming in a way, like a forgotten piece of the past. We were ready for the weekend. After unloading our gear, we all took a moment to appreciate the quiet. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. It was perfect, almost too perfect, but we were all so eager to be away from the chaos of everyday life that we didn't think much about it. The first night passed without incident. We ate a simple meal of grilled food over an open fire, shared some drinks, and swapped old stories from our high school days. The usual fun stuff. We even went for a short hike before dark, just to stretch our legs after the long drive. The sun set early, and by the time we got back to the cabin, the forest had already swallowed the light, leaving only the glow of the fire to keep us company. The second night was different, though. That's when things started to feel off. It started with the quiet. The fire crackled, and the wind blew through the trees, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. I had a strange sense of being watched, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing but the blackness of the woods. I brushed it off. My friends were still chatting around the fire, oblivious to anything strange. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. At one point, I went inside the cabin to grab another drink. The place was small and cozy, with wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I stood in the doorway, looking out the window toward the forest, I thought I saw something move in the distance. It was quick, just a flash of shadow, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I peered harder into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe I was just tired. I didn't mention it to anyone when I went back outside. The night grew colder, and the air felt thicker. The fire burned low, and the chatter around the campfire began to fade. Everyone seemed to be winding down, ready for bed. But just as I was about to go inside, I heard something. It was a soft, rustling sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. This wasn't the soft shuffle of a small animal. It was something heavier, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned to my friend, Nick, who had been sitting closest to me. I could see the same concern in his eyes, a look that mirrored what I was feeling. We both listened, trying to figure out what it was. The rustling stopped, but the sense of something being there, watching us, remained. We stood up, both of us unsure of what to do. "Probably just a deer," Nick muttered, but his voice didn't have the same confidence as usual. "It's probably nothing." I nodded, though I wasn't so sure. I didn't believe in supernatural stuff, no ghosts or spirits. But that didn't mean I wasn't afraid. Fear isn't always logical. Sometimes you just feel it in your gut. We all eventually headed inside. The cabin was warm, and we quickly made ourselves comfortable, pulling out sleeping bags and settling down for the night. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the nagging sense that something was out there. I heard things outside, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something else. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a strange sound in the middle of the night. It wasn't the wind or the usual night noises. It was a scratching sound, slow and methodical, like something was trying to dig into the cabin itself. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was coming from outside or inside the cabin. The sound continued, getting louder, and I could feel my heart racing. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. This was different. I got up quietly, careful not to wake the others. The moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I moved to the door and peeked out into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the noise. First, I saw nothing, just the usual trees and the slight sway of the branches in the wind. But then, my eyes locked onto something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the edge of the firelight, was a figure. It wasn't a man, but it wasn't an animal either. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it seemed to sway in the shadows as if it was made of them. Its limbs were long, too long, and bent at odd angles, like a spider's legs. Its skin, or whatever covered its body, was pale and stretched tight over its bones, with patches of dark, mottled coloring. It had no clothes, no face, just a smooth, featureless head that seemed to reflect the moonlight in a sickly way. It was like looking at a thing from a nightmare, too grotesque to be real. Yet there it was. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The creature's head slowly turned toward the cabin. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, black pits of emptiness that seemed to suck in the light around them. It didn't blink, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. And then it began to move, slowly at first, dragging its long limbs over the forest floor. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, sliding across the earth in an unnatural way, like it wasn't bound by the laws of gravity or nature. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest, and I realized I had to do something. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon or anything normal. This thing was not right. I moved to wake up Nick, but before I could, there was a loud crash from outside. The creature had slammed its arm into a tree, knocking it over with an impossible amount of force. It made a horrible, scraping noise as it slid across the ground, heading straight for the cabin. I had no choice. I had to warn everyone. "Nick," I hissed, shaking him awake. "Get up now." He groggily sat up, blinking in confusion. "What's going on?" "Get to the back door. Now," I whispered urgently. We didn't have time to argue. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. We were miles from any cell towers. The others woke up at the noise, their faces pale with fear. We all scrambled, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the creature outside was getting closer. I could hear its movements, scraping against the earth like claws dragging over stone. Then, there was a sound from the roof. A low, almost guttural noise, like something scraping against the shingles. I couldn't help but glance up at the ceiling, wondering if whatever it was had somehow made its way up there. The scratching noise continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It was closing in on us, circling the cabin, testing our defenses. We bolted for the back door, not bothering to look out the windows anymore. We ran through the dark woods, the trees whipping by, branches snapping under our feet. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding in my chest, and looked back toward the cabin. The creature was gone. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. The others were shaken, terrified, but no one spoke about what we had seen. What could we say? No one would believe us. The next day, we went back to the cabin. Everything seemed normal, too normal. There was no sign of what had happened, no tracks, no broken trees, no evidence of the creature. It was like nothing had happened at all. But I knew what I had seen. It was real. We left shortly after that, and I never went back. I don't know what that creature was, but I know it wasn't something I'd ever want to see again. I'm still not sure what it was doing in those woods, or why it was so interested in us, but I've never forgotten that night. It's been years now, but every time I think about it, I get the same feeling I had back then. Like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I hope I never have to face it again. The sun was already low in the sky when I arrived at the cabin. The gravel road I had been following curved sharply between tall pine trees, and as I got closer, the scent of damp earth mixed with pine needles grew stronger. The place looked exactly as I remembered from the photos. An old wooden cabin with weathered logs, a stone chimney, and a rusty metal roof that had clearly seen many winters. The windows were dusty, and some had spider webs in the corners. It was quiet here, almost too quiet. No cars, no people, no sounds of animals. Just the wind whispering through the branches. I pulled my car to the side and grabbed my bag. The cabin was about 50 feet back from the road, surrounded by thick undergrowth and fallen leaves. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my boots. I had been looking forward to a weekend alone, a break from everything, work, noise, phones. Just me and the woods. The keys I found taped under the flower pot worked in the door, and it opened with a groan. Inside, the air was cool and stale, smelling faintly of wood smoke and old dust. The cabin was small. The living area had a stone fireplace, a worn-out couch, and a simple wooden table. A small kitchen with an old stove and a fridge that still hummed quietly. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a tiny bathroom. There was a pile of firewood stacked next to the door, and a stack of newspapers on the table from 2 years ago. It was clear no one had been here for a while. I dropped my bag by the couch and went to open the windows. The glass was grimy but still let in enough light to see the cabin in a soft glow. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, a wall of green shadows that shifted as the wind moved through the branches. The sun was almost gone, and I knew soon it would get dark fast. I set about making a fire. The fireplace was cold and blackened with soot, but the wood smelled dry. I arranged some kindling and stacked logs carefully, then struck a match. The flame caught quickly, and soon the room filled with the crackling sound of burning wood. The warmth was comforting, but I could feel the chill of the coming night seeping through the walls. I made a cup of coffee with the small stove, the smell of it mixing with the pine and smoke. Outside, the shadows grew longer, and the woods seemed to close in tighter. I moved slowly around the cabin, turning on the little battery-powered lanterns I had brought. The light was weak, but enough to push the darkness away from the corners. Still, the night pressed in through the thin walls. After dinner, I sat by the fire watching the flames flicker. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves outside. The wind picked up, and the cabin creaked. I kept telling myself it was just the old wood settling. I wasn't scared. I told myself I was prepared. Later, I went outside to gather firewood for the night. The forest was darker than I expected, and I wished I had brought a flashlight. The moon was a thin sliver, barely lighting the path. I used my phone's flashlight, but the battery was low. I moved carefully, feeling my way around the uneven ground. The trees stood tall and close, their branches reaching out like fingers. I collected a small pile of wood and hurried back to the cabin. Once inside, I locked the door and shuttered the windows. The feeling of being watched was still there, faint but persistent. I poured another cup of coffee and sat down again by the fire. The cabin was cozy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around midnight, I heard it, a low sound, like heavy breathing, coming from just outside the cabin. I froze. The wind was calm now, and the forest was silent except for that breathing. It wasn't a person's breath, not quite. It was slower, heavier, something big. My heart pounded as I sat very still, staring at the door. The sound moved closer, then stopped. I tried to listen carefully, but the darkness made it impossible to see anything through the windows. The breathing continued, steady and slow. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the table and crept to the door. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain and shone the light outside. There was nothing there. The porch was empty. No footprints, no movement. Just the shadowy shapes of the trees swaying slightly in the night breeze. I felt relief wash over me, but it didn't last. From somewhere deeper in the forest came a sharp crack, like a branch breaking under weight. The breathing stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, the flashlight close, the fire burning low. Every noise made me jump. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, I was exhausted but still alert. The next morning, I went outside carefully. The ground was damp with dew. I looked for footprints but found none near the cabin. Only animal tracks, deer and smaller creatures. Whatever had made that noise was gone, or never there close by. I told myself it must have been a wild animal, maybe a bear sniffing around. I spent the day cleaning the cabin, chopping more wood, and trying to relax. The sun warmed the small clearing, and birds called from the trees. I even managed to read for a while, the quiet allowing my mind to calm. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Every time I looked out the window into the forest, the shadows seemed deeper, darker. By afternoon, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and sending leaves swirling around the clearing. The forest noise changed too, growing quieter, as if the animals had stopped moving. That evening, as the sun set, I noticed something strange. The firewood I had stacked neatly by the door was scattered, some pieces lying far from the pile, broken or moved. I hadn't heard anything during the day, but now I was certain someone, or something, had been here. I checked the doors and windows again, making sure everything was locked tight. I grabbed my knife from my bag and sat by the fire, the flames feeling smaller and weaker now that the light outside was gone. Around 10 p.m., the noises started again. This time it was more than breathing. There were footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs, the soft scrape of something brushing against the wall. I held the flashlight tightly, shining it out the window every time I heard movement. Suddenly, the porch light flickered. The old bulb in the cabin's exterior lamp must have been loose. The darkness outside pulsed with the light, casting eerie shadows between the trees. My pulse raced. The footsteps stopped near the door, and I held my breath. After a long silence, the sound of something heavy dropping to the ground echoed outside. I shone the flashlight toward the door and saw a large branch lying there, snapped from a nearby tree. The footsteps moved away slowly, fading into the forest. I sat frozen, heart hammering in my chest. I thought about leaving, packing everything up and driving back to the safety of town, but something made me stay. I was determined not to let fear win. I stayed up the rest of the night, watching the door, the windows, the trees just beyond the porch light. Morning came again, and I was tired but alive. I walked around the clearing, looking for signs of who or what had been there. I found deep tracks in the soft earth, larger than any deer's, with claw marks. Bear tracks, definitely. Probably a big male, curious or hungry. I realized then that I was alone in their territory, and I was the stranger. That afternoon, I decided to prepare better. I gathered more wood, secured the windows with extra nails I found in a small toolbox, and made sure to lock every door carefully. I found a heavy iron poker by the fireplace and kept it nearby. Night came again, and this time the noises returned sooner. The footsteps started just after sunset, circling slowly, stopping now and then to sniff the air. I could smell the faint, musky scent of a wild animal outside. I stayed close to the fire, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Hours passed. The sounds moved farther away, then closer again. At one point, I heard a low growl, deep and threatening, just beyond the clearing. My hands trembled as I gripped the poker, ready if I had to defend myself. But nothing attacked. The forest was alive with sounds, but the threat stayed on the edge. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted and trembling. I packed my bag quickly. The forest seemed calm now, but I didn't want to wait to find out if the night would bring more. Before leaving, I looked around one last time. The tracks in the dirt were clear evidence. This place was home to large predators, and I had been walking through it unaware. I started the car and looked back at the cabin. The quiet woods seemed peaceful in the morning light, but I knew better. The forest was alive, dangerous, and I had been a visitor in its world. As I drove away, the sense of relief was overwhelming. The cabin was beautiful and quiet, but it wasn't safe, not without preparation and respect for the wild. I made a promise to myself to be more careful, to respect the forest and its residents. I would come back one day. I had been looking forward to that trip for weeks. A cabin in the middle of nowhere, just me and the quiet woods around me. No internet, no phone signal, no distractions. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the pressure of work, and just be alone with nature for a few days. I needed the peace, and the plan was simple. Drive up, settle in, hike around during the day, read by the fire at night. The drive was long but beautiful. The last 10 miles were a rough dirt road, twisting through thick trees, past old logging clearings and mossy rocks. My little rental car bumped along, making me glad I wasn't in anything lower to the ground. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I kept my window cracked a little, letting in the cool scent of the forest. The cabin was exactly what I expected. Small, made of rough logs, with a tin roof that caught the last rays of the afternoon sun. It sat on a slight rise, overlooking a patch of open meadow that rolled down into thick woods. There was a narrow trail leading from the cabin down into the trees, and I could see the faint line of a creek a few hundred yards away. It was quiet, dead quiet, except for the occasional bird call or the far-off rustling of something moving through the underbrush. I parked the car and unloaded my bag. I took a moment just standing there, looking around, feeling the stillness settle on me like a blanket. The sun was low, and the shadows were stretching out long and soft. I unlocked the cabin door. It creaked on rusty hinges, and stepped inside. Inside was simple but cozy. A small kitchen area with a propane stove and a sink that I wasn't sure even worked. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed pushed up against the far wall covered in a thick quilt, and a small wood stove that looked like it had been the heart of this place for years. A stack of firewood sat neatly piled outside the door. I unpacked a few things, lit the stove, and started a fire. The smell of burning wood filled the room, making it feel warm and alive. I boiled water for some tea and sat down at the table with a book. The silence was soothing, but as night fell, it also felt heavier. The windows framed the blackness outside, broken only by the flicker of firelight on the trees. After a while, I decided to explore the property a bit before dark fully took over. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the thick shadows of the woods, lighting up the rough bark of trees and patches of moss on the ground. I followed the faint trail that led down to the creek. The water was low and slow, barely more than a trickle, but it made a steady, calming sound as it moved over rocks and fallen branches. I crouched down to splash some on my face. The air was cooler down by the water, and I could smell the fresh dampness of the soil. There were no other sounds except for the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I stayed there for a few minutes, then turned back toward the cabin. The forest seemed to close in tighter as I walked, the trees standing close together, their branches like arms stretching overhead. The flashlight caught a few glints, eyes maybe, or just the reflection of the light on wet leaves. I didn't stop to look too closely. Back at the cabin, I checked my supplies. Enough food for a few days, water, a small first aid kit, and the basic tools I had packed. I set an alarm on my phone for the next morning, hoping it would have at least a bit of signal before I lost it. The first night was mostly uneventful, though I kept waking up at odd times, hearing noises outside. The wind brushing through the trees, maybe a deer moving nearby, branches knocking against the cabin walls. Each sound felt louder than it should have, echoing in the stillness. I told myself it was just the woods being alive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. The second day, I got up early and went for a longer hike. The trail wound through dense forest and climbed up a ridge that gave a clear view over the valley below. The air was crisp, and I could see a layer of mist clinging to the trees in the low spots. I spotted a few deer grazing quietly and heard the distant call of a hawk. I paused often, just breathing it all in. The smell of pine, the soft crunch of dry leaves underfoot, the sharp tang of cold air. The silence was different from the city. It wasn't empty, it was full, but gentle. Full of sounds I didn't always notice. On the way back, I saw a set of tracks in the dirt near the creek. Large, with a wide pad and long claws. I guess they were from a bear, which didn't surprise me. I'd read this area was home to black bears. I made a mental note to be careful with my food and not to wander alone after dark. That night, the wind picked up. The trees moaned and creaked like old timbers. I made sure the fire was burning strong inside the stove and double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. I sat by the fire, sipping tea and reading, but my eyes kept darting to the windows. Around midnight, I heard something else, a low sound from outside. Not the wind, but a heavy breathing close by. My heart jumped. I froze and listened. The breathing stopped. I waited, breath held. Then came a faint scrape, like claws dragging over wood. It was coming from the side of the cabin, where the firewood was stacked. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The beam scanned the firewood pile. Nothing, no movement, just shadows and the empty blackness of the forest beyond. I called out softly, but no answer came. I thought about the bear tracks I'd seen earlier. Maybe it had come close, curious about the fire or the smell of food. I moved a bit louder, banging a stick on the side of the cabin, trying to scare it off. The sounds stopped. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking slightly as I sat back down by the stove. The fire crackled and popped, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every sound outside made me tense, alert. The forest felt alive in a way I hadn't expected, dark and unpredictable. The next morning, I checked the perimeter around the cabin. There were scratch marks on the logs near the woodpile, long, deep grooves that looked fresh. A few broken twigs and disturbed leaves told me something had definitely been there overnight. I spent the day clearing the area around the cabin, dragging the firewood pile a little further away from the door, making a small fence out of fallen branches. Felt stupid, like I was a kid making a fort, but it helped calm my nerves. The days passed and the visits, or whatever they were, continued. I never saw the animal clearly, but the signs were always there. More scratch marks, footprints in the mud, disturbed leaves. The occasional broken branch snapped off just out of reach. I stayed on high alert, sleeping with a knife by my bed and keeping a heavy stick near the door. I cooked meals inside and made sure to keep the smell of food minimal outside. On the fourth day, I decided it was time to hike out. I wanted to get some last daylight in, then pack up and head back before dark. I took the trail toward the creek again, moving quickly but carefully. Halfway there, I heard something crashing through the underbrush behind me. Heavy steps, fast. I stopped and turned, shining my flashlight back the way I'd come. Nothing. Then I heard it again, closer, louder. The sound of a large animal breaking branches and moving fast. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran, heart pounding, breath ragged, back the way I'd come. The trail was uneven, roots and rocks tripping me up, but I kept moving as fast as I could. Behind me, the crashing kept coming, but I didn't look back. I focused on the path ahead, the cabin light just visible through the trees. I burst through the trees and into the clearing. The cabin was right there, the door wide open, as if waiting for me. I slammed it shut, locked it, and pushed a heavy chair against it. Then I backed away to the small window and peeked out. For a moment, the woods were still. Then a large black shape stepped into the edge of the clearing. A bear. Big, dark, with eyes that caught the light and seemed to study me. It stood still for a long minute, then slowly turned and disappeared back into the forest. I didn't move until I was sure it was gone. Then I packed quickly, taking only what I could carry. The drive out was tense, every shadow on the side of the road making me jump. But the sun was rising as I reached the highway, and the world began to feel safe again. I learned something that trip, that the woods are alive and wild, and that nature doesn't care if you're there or not. It reminded me how small I was, and how important it was to respect the quiet power of the world outside the city. When I finally got home, I locked the door behind me and sat down with a long, deep breath. The city noises felt loud and overwhelming, but they were safe. The cabin, the forest, the bear. They were all real, and I was lucky to have made it through. I wasn't ready to go back to that place yet, but I was glad I had seen it for what it was. Wild, beautiful, and dangerous. And I knew that next time, I'd be better prepared. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. A quiet cabin in the woods, miles away from the noise and rush of the city. I needed it. A break from the constant buzz of work, from the crowded streets, from people always talking, always expecting something. Just me, some books, my camera, and the forest. The cabin wasn't fancy. It was old, built maybe 50 years ago, but solid. Wood walls, a stone chimney, small windows that let in light but didn't offer much of a view because thick trees crowded close all around. The road leading to it was a narrow dirt path, barely wide enough for a car, winding and bumping between tall pines and maples. I drove up late Friday afternoon, the sun just beginning to lower behind the hills. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles crushed under my boots as I stepped out of the car. Inside the cabin, it smelled faintly of must and wood smoke. Dust settled thick on old furniture, and the floor creaked underfoot. The fireplace was cold, the stones gray and rough, but I found a box of old firewood stacked in the corner. I set about getting a fire going, careful to arrange the wood just right, sparking with matches until the flames caught and crackled to life. The soft orange light filled the room and chased away some of the shadows that pressed in from the corners. I spent the rest of the evening unpacking, reading by the fire, and making a simple dinner. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and once or twice I heard the distant call of an owl. The cabin was cozy, even if a little dusty, and for a while the quiet was just the kind I wanted. As night fell deeper, I closed the windows and locked the door. I wasn't worried, the place felt safe. The isolation was what I wanted. No one around for miles except the occasional deer or raccoon. But that night, things started to feel different. I woke up around midnight. At first, I thought I was dreaming. A noise, faint but sharp, like something scraping outside the cabin. My heart beat faster as I listened, the sound repeating, slow and methodical. Something was moving near the windows. I told myself it was just the wind pushing against a branch, but the sound didn't shift or change like a branch would. It was heavier, deliberate, scraping. I got up slowly, feeling the cold floor under my bare feet as I moved to the window and peeked through the curtain. The darkness outside was deep and thick. No moonlight, just the black shape of trees pressed close. Nothing moved. I opened the door just a crack, and the cold night air rushed in. I leaned out and scanned the ground near the cabin. There, by the side, were marks in the dirt. Deep scratches, long and uneven, as if something large had clawed at the earth. My skin prickled, but I couldn't see what made the marks. I shut the door and locked it again, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I decided to light the fire again, hoping the warmth and light would chase away whatever was out there. The fire grew, casting flickering shadows that danced along the walls. I sat close, wrapped in a blanket, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. Hours passed. The noises stopped. I started to believe maybe it was just an animal, a bear or a large raccoon, or a deer brushing against the cabin. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching, something big. Morning came slowly, the sky lightening to gray and blue through the small window panes. I stepped outside, breath steaming in the cool air, and looked at the marks again. They were fresh. The earth hadn't dried or settled yet. I followed them carefully around the cabin. They ended near the back, where thick bushes grew wild and tall. I grabbed a sturdy stick and pushed the bushes aside. Behind them was a small clearing, covered in fallen leaves and broken twigs. Something had disturbed the ground here. I saw more deep claw marks on the trees, as if an animal had tried to climb or rub itself against the bark. A cold wave ran through me. I spent the day exploring around the cabin, trying to push my mind away from the night's fears. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, and the sun filtered through the leaves, making dappled patterns on the ground. I collected firewood, refilled the water jug from a nearby stream, and even spotted a pair of deer grazing in the distance. The woods were peaceful in the light. Still, as the afternoon waned and the sun dipped lower, I felt eyes on me. Not literally, but the feeling of being watched grew heavier. I kept hearing snaps of branches, faint rustles in the brush, but every time I turned, nothing was there. I thought about leaving, but the road was muddy from recent rain, and my car was parked a good 20 minutes away by foot. I decided to stay, but to be more careful. That night was worse. I tried to read by the fire, but every shadow seemed to shift. Every crack of wood or distant animal call made my skin crawl. Then the scraping started again, louder and closer. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit my face, and the beam of the light cut through the blackness. I shone it across the clearing near the cabin and into the forest beyond. I caught a flash of movement, something large and low to the ground. I froze, heart hammering. The beam landed on a pair of eyes, reflecting yellow and unblinking. The shape shifted, a large black bear maybe, or something else. It growled low and deep, a sound that shook the air and made the hair on my arms stand up. I stepped back inside quickly and slammed the door shut. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and cold sweats. I stayed near the fire, poking it to keep it alive, trying to ignore every sound outside. In the morning, I packed quickly. I didn't want to stay another night. I checked the path back to the car, noticing more fresh tracks. Paw prints and claw marks deep in the soft dirt. The bear was close, maybe curious, maybe territorial. I drove away from the cabin slowly, eyes scanning the trees. The road was rough and narrow, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to safety. After a while, the forest thinned, and I could see signs of civilization again. Power lines, distant houses, a familiar gas station. The tension in my shoulders eased. That weekend was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a break from stress. Instead, it became a reminder that nature can be quiet but also unpredictable, dangerous if you're not careful. I never went back to that cabin. The scratches on the door, the claw marks on the trees, the glowing eyes in the night, they stayed with me long after I left. But I learned something important. Sometimes, being alone in the woods isn't just peaceful isolation. It's a test of respect for the wild and its boundaries. I carry that memory now, and when I think of that cabin, I remember how close I came to something wild and real. Not a story or a ghost, just nature's raw power watching and waiting in the dark. And for me, that's scarier than anything made up. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea of a quiet weekend in a cabin, deep in the woods, away from phones, traffic, and people, sounded like the perfect break. I booked a small cabin in a state forest that I'd never been to before. The pictures showed a tiny wooden building with peeling paint, a porch with a swinging bench, and a rusted old grill off to one side. It was a little rough around the edges, but exactly what I wanted. The forest there was thick and dark, filled with tall pines that looked like they'd been standing for hundreds of years. The map showed a narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, and beyond that, miles of trails. I packed light but made sure to bring the essentials: a heavy flashlight, a sturdy knife, matches in a waterproof case, some canned food, bottled water, and a small first aid kit. I didn't tell many people where I was going. I wanted the solitude. Driving there, the road got rougher and narrower, the trees pressing close on either side, their branches scratching the car windows. The sun was beginning to set by the time I pulled up to the cabin. The air smelled like pine needles and earth, fresh and cold. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no insects buzzing, no rustle of wind in the leaves. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just evening and most animals had gone to sleep. I unloaded my bag and took my time setting up. The cabin had a small wood stove, a kitchen table, and a bed with a thin mattress. The windows were grimy and let in little light, but I liked the old feel of it. I built a fire in the stove and lit some candles I had brought. The small flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the room feel alive in the dark. After heating some soup on the stove, I sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the silence. I thought about how good this was: no city noise, no buzzing phones, just me and the woods. The sky darkened, and stars began to peek through the gaps in the branches overhead. I kept the flashlight close by just in case. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me jump. A twig snapping outside, the creak of the old cabin settling, the distant howl of an animal. I reminded myself I was alone, and that was the point. Still, there was something unsettling about being so isolated. The night felt thicker here, heavier, as if the forest was watching me. I checked my supplies again and again, making sure the knife was sharp and the matches dry. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly to the sound of something scratching at the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight and shone it outside. Nothing was there, just the blackness of the woods. The scratching stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but the forest was silent again. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other animal. The cabin was old and the door frames loose. Small animals could get curious. The next day, I decided to explore the nearby trails. I packed a small bag with water, a sandwich, and my knife, and headed out before sunrise. The forest looked different in daylight, alive, buzzing with life. Birds chirped, squirrels darted through the underbrush, and the smell of damp earth was everywhere. I followed a trail marked on the map, winding through tall trees and past moss-covered rocks. I felt peaceful again, forgetting the weird feeling from the night before. About 2 hours into my hike, I came across something strange. The trail forked at the base of a steep hill, and off to the right, near a cluster of thick bushes, I saw fresh footprints. They were big, far bigger than mine. At first, I thought maybe a large dog or a deer, but the prints were different, heavier, with deep indentations. The shape looked almost like a bear's, but the pattern was odd. I crouched down and examined the prints closely. There were no claw marks, just deep, rounded impressions. They headed off the trail and into the dense woods. I felt a strange chill run through me and decided to head back. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something was watching me. The sun was high by the time I returned to the cabin. I locked the door behind me, double-checked the windows, and made a stronger fire in the stove. I ate quickly and tried to shake off the unease. That night, I stayed awake longer, sitting close to the fire with my knife on the table. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the scratching, but this time louder and closer, coming from the side of the cabin. My hands shook as I grabbed the flashlight and slowly moved toward the back door. The beam caught a glimpse of movement, dark shapes darting between the trees. I could hear heavy breathing and low, guttural sounds, almost like growls. I froze. Whatever it was big. I didn't want to believe it was an animal, but nothing else made sense. My mind raced. Could it be a bear or something else? I wasn't sure. I tried to stay calm, making noise by banging a metal pan against the wall. The sounds stopped abruptly. For a long minute, there was silence. Then I heard the heavy footsteps moving away into the woods. The next morning, I found deep scratches on the cabin side near the back door. The wood was splintered in places, with chunks missing. There were also large paw prints in the soft ground around the cabin, much bigger than any dogs or deer's. I packed my things quickly. I decided I wasn't safe here. I drove as fast as I dared down the rough dirt road, looking in my rearview mirror often, half expecting to see something following me. The forest seemed to close in behind me, and the weight of those silent, watching trees felt like it was pushing me out. When I got back to civilization, I called the park rangers and reported what I'd seen and heard. They told me bears were common in that area, but the claw marks and footprints I described didn't quite match typical bear behavior. They said they'd send someone to check it out. Even now, weeks later, I'm not sure what I encountered in those woods. I know it wasn't a normal animal, at least not one I'd ever heard of. The experience left me shaken but grateful I got out in one piece. The forest can be beautiful and peaceful, but it's also wild and unpredictable. Sometimes, there are things out there that don't want to be found, and when you stumble into their territory, you learn to respect the silence and the dark. The wind had been picking up since late afternoon, rattling the thin window panes of the small cabin. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that promised rain but didn't quite let it fall yet. I was alone out here, miles from the nearest road, tucked deep in the forest where the trees grew thick and old, their trunks twisted and bent by years of wind and snow. This was my first time staying here alone, a little getaway to disconnect, but as night fell, I started feeling the kind of quiet that seeps into your bones. The cabin itself was simple, a one-room shack with a stove, a small sink, a cot, and a handful of shelves lined with dusty books and canned food. The wood smelled faintly of pine and old smoke, a mix that somehow felt comforting and unsettling at the same time. I had spent the day unpacking and chopping firewood, trying to get the place warmed up before night came. But now that the darkness was pressing in, the silence felt almost too heavy. I lit a fire in the stove, watching the flames crackle and glow. Outside, the forest was thick with shadows. I could hear the wind whispering through the branches, the occasional snap of a twig far off in the dark. Nothing moved close enough to see, but the sounds made me acutely aware that I was not entirely alone. I had brought enough food to last a few days, but as the evening wore on, I found myself getting restless. I tried to read, but my eyes kept darting to the window. There was a thin layer of frost starting to form on the glass, and beyond it, the trees looked like black ghosts stretching toward the sky. The only light came from the fire and the small oil lamp I had on the table. The cabin was tight, with low ceilings and bare wooden walls, but it felt safe, or it should have. My heart started pounding harder as the wind shifted, sending a sudden gust against the cabin walls. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps crunching on the snow outside. I froze, listening hard. The wind carried the sounds away, or maybe I had imagined it. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Animals, probably. Deer, maybe, or a fox. But the quiet came back after the wind died down, and that deep silence was worse than anything. It was the kind of silence that made the mind race, filling the gaps with all sorts of things you don't want to think about. I got up and closed the curtains, even though it didn't stop the feeling of being watched. The woods outside were like a black wall, unbroken except for the faint shapes of trees. The snow on the ground was barely visible, a dull white sheen under the faint light of the moon breaking through the clouds. Hours passed. I stayed close to the fire, adding wood as it died down. The air was cold and dry inside the cabin, and my breath made little clouds in front of me. Somewhere, a bird called out, a long, low sound that echoed through the trees, eerie in the stillness. Then came the noise. Not a snap or a rustle, but something heavier, slower, like footsteps on snow, but heavier than any deer or fox I had ever heard. The sound was steady, deliberate, coming from just outside the cabin. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to believe someone or something was out there, so close. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the cabin's small porch light. I could feel my heart in my throat. My fingers trembled as I reached for the old hunting rifle leaning in the corner. I wasn't a hunter, never used it much, but I knew how to handle it enough to feel some control. The wind shifted again, and the trees groaned. The footsteps started again, moving slowly along the edge of the clearing. I caught a glimpse of a shape large, hunched, moving with a kind of cautious patience. It was too dark to see well, but it was definitely not an animal. Not a deer or a bear. It was something else, something human, but I couldn't tell if it was a man or something else entirely. I wanted to call out, to demand whoever or whatever it was leave me alone, but my voice caught in my throat. I was frozen, every muscle tight, waiting for the next sound. The figure stopped again, right at the edge of the porch light. I could hear breathing, deep, heavy, ragged. Then it moved quickly, darting behind a tree. I scrambled to the door, heart pounding, fumbling with the lock. I wanted to bolt outside, but the snow was deep and the dark forest stretched out like a trap. Instead, I pulled the curtains tight, locked the door, and slid to the floor behind it. Minutes passed like hours. I stayed as still as possible, listening to the muffled sounds outside, the crunch of footsteps moving away, then silence. I didn't dare move until long after, when I convinced myself the figure had left. The night stretched on, but I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those heavy footsteps, felt the weight of being watched. I stayed near the fire, clutching the rifle, until dawn finally broke, painting the sky pale blue and soft pink. In the light of morning, the world looked peaceful again. The snow glittered, the trees stood silent, and the wind had calmed. I stepped outside carefully, scanning the edge of the clearing. There were footprints, large, booted tracks, circling the cabin, but no sign of who they belonged to. I gathered my things quickly. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge. I had come here to find peace, to disconnect from the noise of the world, but instead I found something else entirely: fear, the kind that burrows deep and doesn't easily let go. I left the rifle by the door and started the long walk back toward the road, my steps crunching loudly in the snow. The woods seemed to watch me as I went, but this time I didn't look back. I kept moving forward, toward the safety of the world I knew. When I finally reached my car hours later, I was exhausted but relieved. The quiet of the cabin was replaced by the hum of the engine and the promise of warmth and light. I drove away, glancing once in the rearview mirror at the dark line of trees fading behind me. The woods held their secrets tight, but I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't be coming back alone. Not ever again. The cabin stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a thick forest that stretched in every direction. It was an old place, weathered by years of wind, rain, and snow. The wood was rough, stained dark with age and moss clinging to the corners where the sun barely reached. The roof sagged slightly, and the porch creaked with every step. It was exactly the kind of place I wanted to get away from everything. No noise, no people, no distractions. I had arrived in the late afternoon, hauling my backpack along the gravel path that wound through the trees. The air was cool, with a faint scent of pine and damp earth. The sun was low, sending golden rays that filtered through the branches in uneven patches. Shadows stretched long across the ground. I unlocked the front door, which groaned in protest, and stepped inside. The cabin's interior was simple but sturdy. A small wood stove sat in the corner, blackened from years of use but still solid. The floor was made of wide planks, worn smooth. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a single bed pushed against the far wall, and a shelf lined with dusty books and some old tools. The windows were small and thick with grime, letting in just enough light to see by. I set my pack down and lit a fire in the stove, the dry wood catching quickly and sending warmth through the chilly room. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees and making the cabin creak as if it were alive. I ate a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, the quiet only broken by the crackling fire and occasional hoot of an owl from deep in the woods. As night fell, the temperature dropped. The darkness outside the windows was thick and solid, a black void where I could make out no shapes. I closed the curtains and sat by the fire, reading a book I'd brought, though my eyes kept drifting to the shadows beyond the glass. Around midnight, I heard something. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling near the cabin. I paused, listening carefully. The wind could have been the cause, but this was different. It was a low, dragging sound, like something heavy moving over dry leaves and sticks. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the noise continued, coming closer. The cabin door was on the porch, a small step up from the ground. I got up and moved to the window closest to it, peering through the grimy glass. The moon was just a sliver, barely lighting the forest floor. I strained my eyes but saw nothing clearly, only the dark outlines of trees and bushes. The sound stopped abruptly. I waited, heart beating a little faster. The quiet returned, broken only by the wind in the trees. I tried to focus on my book again, but every crack and groan from the cabin made me jump. Sleep was out of the question. Suddenly, the sound came back, louder this time, scraping, shuffling. It circled the cabin slowly, as if whatever it was inspecting the place. I could hear dry leaves crunching and branches snapping softly. Then, a heavy thud against the side of the cabin made me jump back. Something had hit the wall hard enough to shake the whole building. I grabbed my flashlight and edged to the door, the beam cutting through the darkness outside. The porch was empty. The ground was covered with leaves and small branches, but no footprints or clear signs of anything. I checked the lock on the door. It was secure. Still, the feeling of being watched settled deep in my chest. The night stretched on. Every few minutes, the noise would return. Scratches at the window, heavy breathing just beyond the walls, a soft thump on the roof. I stayed near the fire, throwing logs on to keep the flames bright and warm, hoping whatever it was would lose interest and leave. Hours passed like that. Exhaustion finally pulled at me, and I nodded off in a chair near the stove, still clutching the flashlight. I woke with a start to a loud banging on the front door. My heart thundered in my chest. I reached for my pocket knife and crept to the door, shining the light through the small window. Nothing was there. The banging stopped, and only the wind whispered through the trees. Morning came slow and gray. The forest looked calm in the cold light, the silence almost peaceful. I stepped outside, the ground damp with overnight frost. Around the cabin, I found broken branches and flattened grass, but no footprints or tracks that could tell me what had been prowling so close in the dark. I spent the day checking the cabin, making sure everything was secure. I fixed a loose board on the porch and cleared away the debris. The woods seemed less threatening in the daylight, but I felt a constant unease, like the night had left a shadow behind. The next evening, I decided not to wait for the dark to fall. I gathered my things and packed quickly, eager to leave the cabin and the forest behind. The path back through the trees was narrow and uneven, but I moved faster than I had on arrival, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the previous night. As I walked, I heard the faint rustling again, not from behind, but up ahead. I stopped and looked, the beam of my flashlight catching the outline of a large animal just at the edge of the tree line. It was a bear, big and dark, standing on all fours but motionless. Its eyes reflected the light, fixed on me. I froze. The bear took a slow step forward, then another, its heavy breathing loud in the still night. I kept my light steady, trying not to show fear. Slowly, it turned and disappeared deeper into the forest. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran the rest of the way to my car, heart pounding, breath ragged. The doors locked behind me with a reassuring click. I sat there for a moment, letting the engine warm up before driving away, the cabin shrinking in the rearview mirror. The woods were quiet now, but the memory of those long hours, the sounds, the dark shapes just beyond the light, stayed with me. It wasn't ghosts or shadows playing tricks. It was real, raw nature at its most unsettling. I learned that night how small and vulnerable I really was out there. And even though I left that place behind, I still hear the scraping and the thuds in my mind, reminders that some things are better left alone. The forest had a way of swallowing sounds and light, folding everything in tight around the little cabin where I was staying. I had picked this spot on a whim, a last-minute decision to escape the noise of the city, to be somewhere silent and still for a few days. The cabin was small but sturdy, made of rough logs, with a stone chimney that looked like it belonged there naturally, as if the trees themselves had grown around it. It sat at the edge of a clearing, the forest stretching out thick and dark in every direction, a dense wall of pine and fir. I had arrived in the afternoon, the sky overcast with clouds that promised rain, the air crisp and smelling of wet earth and moss. Inside, the cabin was simple but welcoming. A single room with a wooden table, 2 chairs, a small stove, and a bed pushed against the far wall. A stack of firewood sat neatly by the door, and a window looked out onto the clearing and the trees beyond. I unpacked slowly, my movements the only sound, except for the occasional creak of the logs settling. I wanted to stay offline, away from the endless noise of messages and alerts, to just be with myself for a while. As the sun dipped lower, shadows lengthened and the forest grew darker. I built a fire in the stove, the smell of burning wood filling the cabin. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes and making the trees sway. I ate a simple meal, something I had brought with me, and settled down with a book, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. The woods were too quiet, almost unnervingly so. No birds singing, no rustling of small animals, just the wind in the branches. Night came quickly. I closed the curtains, though the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls close and confining. The fire in the stove was just a faint glow, and the shadows it cast flickered and danced. Outside, the wind howled softly, a low, steady sound that pressed against the walls. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft thud, like a heavy footfall, just outside the cabin. I froze, listening. Then another, slow, deliberate, spaced far apart. Someone or something was moving through the clearing. My heart quickened. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but it didn't sound quite right. There was a weight to the steps, a presence. I stood and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The clearing was dimly lit by the faint moonlight breaking through the clouds, but I saw nothing. No animal, no person. The steps stopped near the edge of the trees. Then I heard a soft scrape against the wooden wall, a slow, dragging noise. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the flashlight I had left on the table and aimed it out the window. The beam cut a path through the darkness, illuminating the rough bark of the trees and patches of brush. Nothing moved. The wind was quieter now, but the air felt thick, heavy, as if waiting. Minutes passed. Then the scraping sound again, this time from the other side of the cabin. I moved quietly, heart pounding, to another window. The flashlight beam swept over the dark woods, catching only the twisted shapes of branches and leaves. I thought about calling someone, but there was no signal here. The forest had swallowed any chance of contact. I was alone, truly alone. I sat back down, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe it was an animal after all, a bear or a large predator passing through. I had read that bears sometimes wander close to cabins, especially if there was food nearby. I checked the small trash bag I had, nothing edible inside. Still, the idea that a bear might be outside made my skin crawl. Then I heard a faint rustling from the porch. Not a large sound, but distinct against the silence. Someone was there. My mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be another camper? Someone lost or just wandering? Or something worse? I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and held it tightly, the cold metal grounding me. I moved to the door, heart in my throat, and peered through the peephole. No one. The porch was empty. I stepped outside slowly, the wood creaking beneath my feet. The night air was cool and damp, smelling of pine and earth. I shone the flashlight across the clearing. Nothing but shadows. I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin, moving cautiously around it. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, sharp smell. Not quite like anything I recognized, maybe something organic and raw. I paused, feeling exposed and vulnerable. Then, as I reached the back of the cabin, I saw it. Footprints in the dirt. Large, heavy prints, the shape of boots, pressed into the soft ground near the edge of the trees. They circled the cabin, coming close but never stepping on the porch itself. Someone had been there and they had walked all the way around. The prints stopped near a fallen log at the edge of the clearing. Beyond, the forest was a wall of blackness. I shone the flashlight into the trees, the beam catching broken branches and scattered leaves. The prints disappeared there. I went back inside, locking the door and bolting the window shutters. My hands trembled as I sat down, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who was out there? What did they want? I remembered the small radio I had brought, the kind campers used to communicate. I turned it on, hoping to catch a signal, but only static answered. The forest had claimed this place completely. Hours passed in uneasy silence. Every snap of a twig, every creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept the knife nearby and the flashlight ready. Sleep was impossible. Just before dawn, the wind died down. The forest settled into a quiet hush. I crept to the window and looked out. The clearing was empty. No footprints, no movement. The sun rose slowly, filtering pale light through the trees. I packed my things quickly, my heart still pounding, eager to leave the cabin behind. I locked the door one last time and stepped out into the cool morning air. As I walked to my car parked a little way down the trail, I looked back once more. The cabin stood silent, innocent in the daylight, but I knew better now. The forest held secrets, shadows that moved just beyond the light. I drove away slowly, the road winding through the trees, my hands gripping the wheel tight. I didn't look back again. The woods were peaceful by day, but I understood then. Some places are best left alone once the night falls. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a quiet escape from the constant noise of the city, a break from work, and the perfect chance to get away from everything. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but the forest stretching out all around it. Just me and a couple of old friends, all eager to reconnect and relax for a few days. The drive up had been long but scenic. We passed rolling hills and quiet, winding roads that seemed to get narrower with every turn, until we finally reached the cabin. It was a small, rustic place, with peeling wood on the outside and a steep, pitched roof that looked like something out of an old postcard. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, but not in the kind of way that makes you run in fear. It was charming in a way, like a forgotten piece of the past. We were ready for the weekend. After unloading our gear, we all took a moment to appreciate the quiet. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. It was perfect, almost too perfect, but we were all so eager to be away from the chaos of everyday life that we didn't think much about it. The first night passed without incident. We ate a simple meal of grilled food over an open fire, shared some drinks, and swapped old stories from our high school days. The usual fun stuff. We even went for a short hike before dark, just to stretch our legs after the long drive. The sun set early, and by the time we got back to the cabin, the forest had already swallowed the light, leaving only the glow of the fire to keep us company. The second night was different, though. That's when things started to feel off. It started with the quiet. The fire crackled, and the wind blew through the trees, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. I had a strange sense of being watched, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing but the blackness of the woods. I brushed it off. My friends were still chatting around the fire, oblivious to anything strange. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. At one point, I went inside the cabin to grab another drink. The place was small and cozy, with wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I stood in the doorway, looking out the window toward the forest, I thought I saw something move in the distance. It was quick, just a flash of shadow, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I peered harder into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe I was just tired. I didn't mention it to anyone when I went back outside. The night grew colder, and the air felt thicker. The fire burned low, and the chatter around the campfire began to fade. Everyone seemed to be winding down, ready for bed. But just as I was about to go inside, I heard something. It was a soft, rustling sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. This wasn't the soft shuffle of a small animal. It was something heavier, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned to my friend, Nick, who had been sitting closest to me. I could see the same concern in his eyes, a look that mirrored what I was feeling. We both listened, trying to figure out what it was. The rustling stopped, but the sense of something being there, watching us, remained. We stood up, both of us unsure of what to do. "Probably just a deer," Nick muttered, but his voice didn't have the same confidence as usual. "It's probably nothing." I nodded, though I wasn't so sure. I didn't believe in supernatural stuff, no ghosts or spirits. But that didn't mean I wasn't afraid. Fear isn't always logical. Sometimes you just feel it in your gut. We all eventually headed inside. The cabin was warm, and we quickly made ourselves comfortable, pulling out sleeping bags and settling down for the night. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the nagging sense that something was out there. I heard things outside, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something else. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a strange sound in the middle of the night. It wasn't the wind or the usual night noises. It was a scratching sound, slow and methodical, like something was trying to dig into the cabin itself. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was coming from outside or inside the cabin. The sound continued, getting louder, and I could feel my heart racing. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. This was different. I got up quietly, careful not to wake the others. The moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I moved to the door and peeked out into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the noise. First, I saw nothing, just the usual trees and the slight sway of the branches in the wind. But then, my eyes locked onto something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the edge of the firelight, was a figure. It wasn't a man, but it wasn't an animal either. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it seemed to sway in the shadows as if it was made of them. Its limbs were long, too long, and bent at odd angles, like a spider's legs. Its skin, or whatever covered its body, was pale and stretched tight over its bones, with patches of dark, mottled coloring. It had no clothes, no face, just a smooth, featureless head that seemed to reflect the moonlight in a sickly way. It was like looking at a thing from a nightmare, too grotesque to be real. Yet there it was. Couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The creature's head slowly turned toward the cabin. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, black pits of emptiness that seemed to suck in the light around them. It didn't blink, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. And then it began to move, slowly at first, dragging its long limbs over the forest floor. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, sliding across the earth in an unnatural way, like it wasn't bound by the laws of gravity or nature. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest, and I realized I had to do something. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon or anything normal. This thing was not right. I moved to wake up Nick, but before I could, there was a loud crash from outside. The creature had slammed its arm into a tree, knocking it over with an impossible amount of force. It made a horrible, scraping noise as it slid across the ground, heading straight for the cabin. I had no choice. I had to warn everyone. "Nick," I hissed, shaking him awake. "Get up now." He groggily sat up, blinking in confusion. "What's going on?" "Get to the back door. Now," I whispered urgently. We didn't have time to argue. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. We were miles from any cell towers. The others woke up at the noise, their faces pale with fear. We all scrambled, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the creature outside was getting closer. I could hear its movements, scraping against the earth like claws dragging over stone. Then, there was a sound from the roof, a low, almost guttural noise, like something scraping against the shingles. I couldn't help but glance up at the ceiling, wondering if whatever it was had somehow made its way up there. The scratching noise continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It was closing in on us, circling the cabin, testing our defenses. We bolted for the back door, not bothering to look out the windows anymore. We ran through the dark woods, the trees whipping by, branches snapping under our feet. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding in my chest, and looked back toward the cabin. The creature was gone. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. The others were shaken, terrified, but no one spoke about what we had seen. What could we say? No one would believe us. The next day, we went back to the cabin. Everything seemed normal, too normal. There was no sign of what had happened. No tracks, no broken trees, no evidence of the creature. It was like nothing had happened at all. But I knew what I had seen. It was real. We left shortly after that, and I never went back. I don't know what that creature was, but I know it wasn't something I'd ever want to see again. I'm still not sure what it was doing in those woods, or why it was so interested in us, but I've never forgotten that night. It's been years now, but every time I think about it, I get the same feeling I had back then. Like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I hope I never have to face it again. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a quiet escape from the constant noise of the city, a break from work, and the perfect chance to get away from everything. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but the forest stretching out all around it. Just me and a couple of old friends, all eager to reconnect and relax for a few days. The drive up had been long but scenic. We passed rolling hills and quiet, winding roads that seemed to get narrower with every turn, until we finally reached the cabin. It was a small, rustic place, with peeling wood on the outside and a steep, pitched roof that looked like something out of an old postcard. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, but not in the kind of way that makes you run in fear. It was charming in a way, like a forgotten piece of the past. We were ready for the weekend. After unloading our gear, we all took a moment to appreciate the quiet. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. It was perfect, almost too perfect, but we were all so eager to be away from the chaos of everyday life that we didn't think much about it. The first night passed without incident. We ate a simple meal of grilled food over an open fire, shared some drinks, and swapped old stories from our high school days. The usual fun stuff. We even went for a short hike before dark, just to stretch our legs after the long drive. The sun set early, and by the time we got back to the cabin, the forest had already swallowed the light, leaving only the glow of the fire to keep us company. The second night was different, though. That's when things started to feel off. It started with the quiet. The fire crackled, and the wind blew through the trees, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. I had a strange sense of being watched, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing but the blackness of the woods. I brushed it off. My friends were still chatting around the fire, oblivious to anything strange. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. At one point, I went inside the cabin to grab another drink. The place was small and cozy, with wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I stood in the doorway, looking out the window toward the forest, I thought I saw something move in the distance. It was quick, just a flash of shadow, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I peered harder into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe I was just tired. I didn't mention it to anyone when I went back outside. The night grew colder, and the air felt thicker. The fire burned low, and the chatter around the campfire began to fade. Everyone seemed to be winding down, ready for bed. But just as I was about to go inside, I heard something. It was a soft rustling sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. This wasn't the soft shuffle of a small animal. It was something heavier, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned to my friend, Nick, who had been sitting closest to me. I could see the same concern in his eyes, a look that mirrored what I was feeling. We both listened, trying to figure out what it was. The rustling stopped, but the sense of something being there, watching us, remained. We stood up, both of us unsure of what to do. "Probably just a deer," Nick muttered, but his voice didn't have the same confidence as usual. "It's probably nothing." I nodded, though I wasn't so sure. I didn't believe in supernatural stuff, no ghosts or spirits. But that didn't mean I wasn't afraid. Fear isn't always logical. Sometimes you just feel it in your gut. We all eventually headed inside. The cabin was warm, and we quickly made ourselves comfortable, pulling out sleeping bags and settling down for the night. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the nagging sense that something was out there. I heard things outside, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something else. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a strange sound in the middle of the night. It wasn't the wind or the usual night noises. It was a scratching sound, slow and methodical, like something was trying to dig into the cabin itself. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was coming from outside or inside the cabin. The sound continued, getting louder, and I could feel my heart racing. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. This was different. I got up quietly, careful not to wake the others. The moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I moved to the door and peeked out into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the noise. First, I saw nothing, just the usual trees and the slight sway of the branches in the wind. But then, my eyes locked onto something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the edge of the firelight, was a figure. It wasn't a man, but it wasn't an animal either. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it seemed to sway in the shadows as if it was made of them. Its limbs were long, too long, and bent at odd angles, like a spider's legs. Its skin, or whatever covered its body, was pale and stretched tight over its bones, with patches of dark, mottled coloring. It had no clothes, no face, just a smooth, featureless head that seemed to reflect the moonlight in a sickly way. It was like looking at a thing from a nightmare, too grotesque to be real. Yet there it was. Couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The creature's head slowly turned toward the cabin. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, black pits of emptiness that seemed to suck in the light around them. It didn't blink, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. And then it began to move, slowly at first, dragging its long limbs over the forest floor. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, sliding across the earth in an unnatural way, like it wasn't bound by the laws of gravity or nature. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest, and I realized I had to do something. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon or anything normal. This thing was not right. I moved to wake up Nick, but before I could, there was a loud crash from outside. The creature had slammed its arm into a tree, knocking it over with an impossible amount of force. It made a horrible, scraping noise as it slid across the ground, heading straight for the cabin. I had no choice. I had to warn everyone. "Nick!" I hissed, shaking him awake. "Get up now." He groggily sat up, blinking in confusion. "What's going on?" "Get to the back door. Now!" I whispered urgently. We didn't have time to argue. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. We were miles from any cell towers. The others woke up at the noise, their faces pale with fear. We all scrambled, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the creature outside was getting closer. I could hear its movements, scraping against the earth like claws dragging over stone. Then there was a sound from the roof. A low, almost guttural noise, like something scraping against the shingles. I couldn't help but glance up at the ceiling. wondering if whatever it was had somehow made its way up there. The scratching noise continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It was closing in on us, circling the cabin, testing our defenses. We bolted for the back door, not bothering to look out the windows anymore. We ran through the dark woods, the trees whipping by, branches snapping under our feet. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding in my chest, and looked back toward the cabin. The creature was gone. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. The others were shaken, terrified, but no one spoke about what we had seen. What could we say? No one would believe us. The next day, we went back to the cabin. Everything seemed normal, too normal. There was no sign of what had happened. No tracks, no broken trees, no evidence of the creature. It was like nothing had happened at all. But I knew what I had seen. It was real. We left shortly after that, and I never went back. I don't know what that creature was, but I know it wasn't something I'd ever want to see again. I'm still not sure what it was doing in those woods, or why it was so interested in us, but I've never forgotten that night. It's been years now, but every time I think about it, I get the same feeling I had back then. Like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I hope I never have to face it again. I always looked forward to my time at the hunting cabin. It wasn't much, just a small structure tucked away deep in the woods, but it was mine. I'd built it myself piece by piece, taking years to get it to a point where I could spend time there without feeling like I was slumming it. It was rustic, with rough-hewn timber walls and a small, sturdy fireplace that kept the whole place warm during the colder months. The scent of pine and fresh earth filled the air whenever I opened the door, a reminder that this place was my retreat, far from the noise of everyday life. The cabin was nestled in the middle of a thick forest, surrounded by trees that stretched high into the sky, blocking out much of the sun during the day. The only way to get there was through a rough, winding dirt road that took a good hour to drive. There was no one around for miles, and that was exactly how I liked it. Most of the time, I'd come up here alone. It was a place to clear my head, think, and if the mood struck me, hunt a little. No pressure, just peace. I'd been up there for about a week, enjoying the solitude when things started to feel different. It started with small things. Noises I couldn't quite place, branches cracking when the wind wasn't blowing, and the odd sensation that I was being watched. At first, I chalked it up to the isolation. You get jumpy when you're alone for too long, right? It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The first night I heard something unusual. I was sitting in front of the fireplace, flipping through an old hunting magazine. The night was still, and the air was crisp, with a slight chill creeping in from outside. The cabin creaked and groaned as it always did, but something felt off. A sudden rustling sound broke the silence, coming from outside. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too close. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound to repeat. Didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I grabbed my rifle and quietly walked to the window. I peered through the thick curtains, but all I could see was the dark expanse of trees and the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the leaves. Nothing. I stood there for a few minutes, straining my eyes, but the forest remained still, quiet. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon rummaging around. I sat back down, but the unease didn't leave me. I tried to focus on the fire, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. The next day, I decided to go for a walk. I needed to shake off that feeling. The woods were my domain. I knew every trail, every bend, every ridge. But as I walked, something felt off. The air was thicker, the silence louder. I noticed fresh tracks in the dirt, large and wide, unlike any animal I'd ever seen before. They didn't look like deer tracks or bear prints. They were too deep, too wide. I crouched down to get a closer look, my fingers brushing the earth. The prints were recent, and they led deeper into the woods. I didn't like the direction they were going. Still, I followed them, though every step I took felt heavier, like the forest was pushing against me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something, or someone was watching. The tracks led me to a small clearing, one I hadn't been to in years. The trees around it were thick, their branches weaving together to form a dense canopy that blocked out much of the light. The clearing was quiet, eerily so. In the center of the clearing, I found something strange. A small, makeshift shelter made of branches and leaves, arranged in a way that didn't look natural. It looked too deliberate, too out of place in the middle of the woods. My pulse quickened as I examined it. Whoever had built this shelter knew what they were doing, and they hadn't gone far. I didn't stay long. Primal instinct kicked in, telling me to get back to the cabin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned around, suddenly aware that I was no longer alone. The sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by the rush of blood in my ears. I walked faster, almost running, until I finally broke through the trees and saw the familiar outline of my cabin. I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. As I approached, I noticed something else. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to make my stomach twist. I hadn't left it open. I hadn't even gone near it. My rifle was still strapped to my back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was now inside my cabin. I approached cautiously, my steps slow and deliberate. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The cabin was still, but there was something different about it. The air felt thick, charged with tension. My eyes scanned the room, taking in everything. The fire was out, the logs in the hearth cold and lifeless. Everything seemed untouched, but something wasn't right. It was too quiet. I moved towards the back of the cabin, where the small window faced the woods. The curtain was drawn back slightly, just enough for someone to peek through. My stomach dropped. I hadn't left the curtain like that. I was sure of it. I checked the rest of the cabin, moving quickly from room to room. Nothing had been disturbed, but the unease continued to grow. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being hunted, like the cabin was no longer my safe haven but a trap. That night, I kept the lights off, the door locked, and my rifle close. The fire was out, but I didn't dare try to light it again. Couldn't relax. I kept hearing things. Scratching at the door, soft footsteps just outside the window. Every time I thought I heard something, I'd freeze, straining my ears to catch the sound again. But it was always silent when I checked. By the time morning came, I hadn't slept at all. My mind was a blur of exhaustion and fear, but I had to get out of there. I packed my things, making sure to keep my rifle close. The moment I stepped outside, I felt a brief sense of relief. The sun was up, the birds were singing, and the woods seemed almost peaceful again. I made it to the truck without incident, but as I drove down the rough road that led back to civilization, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing, just the winding road and the endless trees behind me. It wasn't until I got home that I realized something important. There had been no sign of the tracks I'd followed, no evidence that anyone had been out there at all. The shelter in the clearing had vanished, as if it had never been there. The whole thing didn't make sense. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that cabin. Not until I figured out what had really happened in those woods. Something out there had been watching me, and it wasn't human.